Hello friends, and welcome to Sacred Slumber. I hope your day has been filled with blessings, no matter what time you're joining us or where you are in this beautiful world. Before we begin tonight's journey into the remarkable story of Gideon, I want to invite you to subscribe to Sacred Slumber so you never miss these powerful biblical narratives that can transform your heart and strengthen your faith. Now let's settle in as we explore one of the most extraordinary accounts of courage, faith, and divine intervention in all of Scripture. The sun hung low over the hills of Israel, casting long shadows across a land that had once flowed with milk and honey. But those days seemed like distant memories now. The once prosperous nation had fallen into chaos, its people scattered and hiding like frightened animals. For 7 long years, the Midianites had swept down upon Israel like locusts, devouring everything in their path. Picture, if you will, the terror that gripped every village and farmstead. Families would wake each morning not knowing if this would be the day the raiders would come. Fathers would venture out to check their crops, only to find them trampled and stolen. Children would be hushed to silence at the first sound of hoofbeats on the horizon. The very air seemed thick with fear and desperation. The Midianites, along with their allies, the Amalekites, and other eastern peoples, had turned the conquest of Israel into an annual ritual. Like a plague of locusts, they would arrive at harvest time, their camels beyond counting, stretching across the landscape as far as the eye could see. They would strip the land bare, taking not only the grain and livestock, but also crushing the spirits of God's chosen people. Farmers had abandoned their fields, choosing instead to hide in mountain caves and underground chambers. The marketplaces that once bustled with commerce now stood empty and silent. What should have been a time of celebration and thanksgiving for the harvest had become a season of dread and starvation. Israel's cities, once proud and strong, had crumbled into mere shadows of their former glory. The walls that should have protected the people lay in ruins, and the gates that once welcomed travellers now hung broken on their hinges. It was as if the very blessing of God had departed from the land, leaving behind only sorrow and defeat. In this atmosphere of despair, mothers would gather their children close and whisper the old stories of how God had delivered their ancestors from Egypt, how he had parted the Red Sea and given them victory over mighty enemies. But those stories seemed like fairy tales now, beautiful but impossible dreams from a time when God still cared about his people. The elders of Israel shook their heads in bewilderment. Where was the God of Abraham, Isaac and Jacob? Where was the mighty deliverer who had once fought for them? Had he forgotten his covenant? Had he abandoned them to their enemies forever? It was into this world of darkness and desperation that our story begins, in the small town of Ophrah, where a young man named Gideon was about to discover that God had not forgotten his people, after all. But Gideon, like so many others, had lost hope. He had watched his family's livelihood disappear year after year, and he had grown tired of empty promises and unanswered prayers. On this particular day, as storm clouds gathered on the horizon, both literally and figuratively, Gideon was engaged in the dangerous work of threshing wheat. But he wasn't doing it in the traditional threshing floor, where the grain could be properly separated from the chaff by the wind. Instead, he was hidden away in a wine press, a place where grapes were normally crushed to make wine. It was cramped, inefficient, and poorly ventilated, but it offered something more valuable than convenience. It offered concealment from enemy eyes. As Gideon worked in his makeshift hiding place, sweat dripping from his brow in the confined space, he embodied the broken spirit of his entire nation. Here was a man reduced to secret, fearful labour just to provide basic sustenance for his family. The very act of threshing wheat, once a joyful community celebration, had become a furtive, isolated struggle for survival. Little did Gideon know that this moment of apparent defeat would become the launching pad for one of the most remarkable displays of God's power in human history. The God who seemed absent was actually watching, waiting, and preparing to use this unlikely hero in ways that would astound both friend and foe alike. The rhythm of Gideon's work was steady but tense. Each strike of his flail against the wheat stalks echoed softly in the confined space of the wine press. His eyes darted frequently toward the opening above, watching for any sign of danger. The precious grain he was salvaging represented not just food for today, but hope for tomorrow, assuming the Midianites didn't discover his hiding place. The silence of the afternoon was broken by an unexpected voice. "The Lord is with you, mighty warrior." Gideon's heart nearly stopped. He spun around, flail raised defensively, expecting to see a Midianite scout who had somehow discovered his secret location. Instead, he found himself face to face with a figure unlike any he had ever encountered. The stranger sat calmly beneath the great oak tree that overlooked the wine press, his presence somehow both commanding and peaceful. The greeting struck Gideon as almost mockingly ironic. Mighty warrior? Him? The man who was reduced to threshing wheat in secret, constantly looking over his shoulder in fear. And the Lord is with you? If that were true, then why was Israel suffering under such devastating oppression? "Pardon me, my lord," Gideon replied, his voice heavy with skepticism and pain. "But if the Lord is with us, why has all this happened to us? Where are all his wonders that our ancestors told us about when they said, 'Did not the Lord bring us up out of Egypt?' But now the Lord has abandoned us and given us into the hand of Midian." The words poured out of Gideon like water from a broken dam. Years of frustration, disappointment, and unanswered questions came tumbling forth. He had grown up hearing the magnificent stories of God's mighty deeds, of pillars of fire and cloud, of armies defeated and nations subdued. But where was that God now? Where were those miracles when his people needed them most? The stranger listened patiently to Gideon's outburst, showing no offence at the young man's boldness or apparent lack of faith. There was something in his eyes that spoke of ancient wisdom and unlimited compassion. When Gideon finished speaking, the visitor's response was both simple and earth-shattering. "Go in the strength you have and save Israel out of Midian's hand. Am I not sending you?" The audacity of the command took Gideon's breath away. Save Israel? Him? The implications were staggering. This wasn't a request for him to join an army or support a cause. This was a divine commission to personally lead the deliverance of an entire nation from a seemingly impossible situation. "Pardon me, my lord," Gideon stammered, his mind reeling, "but how can I save Israel? My clan is the weakest in Manasseh, and I am the least in my family." Gideon's response revealed the depth of his feelings of inadequacy. In a culture where tribal strength and family position determined social standing and influence, he saw himself as doubly disqualified. His clan held no political power, commanded no great armies, and possessed no significant wealth. Within that already weak clan, he was the youngest, the most inexperienced, the least likely to be chosen for any position of leadership. But the stranger's next words would echo through the ages as one of the most profound promises ever given to a human being. "I will be with you, and you will strike down all the Midianites, leaving none alive." The promise was comprehensive and absolute. Not some of the Midianites, not most of them, but all of them. The victory would be complete and decisive, but more importantly, it would not depend on Gideon's strength, wisdom, or experience. It would depend entirely on the presence and power of God himself. Still struggling to believe what he was hearing, Gideon made a request that would reveal both his desire for faith and his need for certainty. If now I have found favour in your eyes, give me a sign that it is really you talking to me. Please do not go away until I come back and bring my offering and set it before you. The stranger agreed to wait, and Gideon hurried to his house to prepare an offering. His heart raced as he worked, his hands trembling slightly as he prepared a young goat and made bread from an ephah of flour. This was not a small offering by the standards of his time, especially for a family struggling under the oppression of constant raids. Yet something within him compelled him to give generously, to honour this mysterious visitor properly. When Gideon returned with the prepared food, the stranger instructed him to place the meat and unleavened bread on a rock and pour out the broth. Gideon obeyed, though he couldn't understand the purpose of these strange instructions. What happened next would leave no doubt about the supernatural nature of his visitor. The stranger touched the meat and bread with the tip of the staff he carried, and immediately fire flared from the rock, consuming the entire offering in an instant. The flames burned with an intensity and heat that no ordinary fire could match, leaving nothing behind but the memory of their brilliance. In that same moment, the stranger vanished from sight, disappearing as suddenly and mysteriously as he had appeared. Terror gripped Gideon's heart as the full realization of what had just occurred crashed over him like a mighty wave. This had been no ordinary man, no mere messenger or prophet. This had been the angel of the Lord, a manifestation of God himself. In that moment of understanding, Gideon was overwhelmed not with joy, but with mortal fear. "Alas, sovereign Lord," he cried out in anguish, "I have seen the angel of the Lord face to face." In the ancient world, it was believed that no human could see God and live. The very encounter that should have filled him with confidence instead filled him with terror. Had his boldness in questioning and testing the Lord sealed his doom? Would he die for having stood in the presence of the Almighty? But even in his moment of greatest fear, God's grace reached out to comfort him. The voice of the Lord came to him again, gentle and reassuring. "Peace, do not be afraid, you are not going to die." With his own hands, Gideon built an altar on that spot and called it, "The Lord is Peace." The place where he had threshed wheat in fear and desperation had become holy ground, the site of a divine encounter that would change not only his life, but the destiny of an entire nation. As night fell over Ophrah, Gideon stood beside his new altar, his mind swirling with the magnitude of what had occurred. The God of his ancestors had not abandoned Israel after all. He had been working, planning, preparing for this very moment, and somehow, incredibly, he had chosen Gideon to be his instrument of deliverance. Yet even as faith began to bloom in his heart, doubt lingered like shadows at the edges of his mind. The task before him seemed impossible, the odds insurmountable. How could he, one man from the weakest clan in Manasseh, possibly hope to defeat the countless multitudes of Midian and their allies? It was a question that would lead him to make one of the most famous requests, the divine confirmation in all of Scripture. The days following Gideon's encounter with the angel of the Lord were filled with a mixture of excitement and anxiety. The divine commissioning had been clear and unmistakable, yet the human heart, prone to doubt and fear, struggled to fully embrace what seemed impossible. Gideon found himself caught between the supernatural certainty of his calling and the natural uncertainties of his circumstances. As he went about his daily tasks, Gideon's mind constantly returned to that moment when fire had consumed his offering and the angel had vanished from sight. Had it really happened? In the bright light of day, with the familiar sounds and sights of ordinary life surrounding him, the encounter almost seemed like a dream. Yet the altar he had built stood as a permanent reminder, its stones bearing witness to the reality of what had occurred. Word began to spread quietly through the region about Gideon's calling. Some believed and were filled with hope for the first time in years. Others were sceptical, wondering how this young man could possibly succeed where so many others had failed. Still others were fearful, worried that any attempt at resistance would only bring more severe retaliation from their oppressors. The weight of responsibility pressed heavily on Gideon's shoulders. He was being asked not just to risk his own life, but potentially to lead others to their deaths. What if he had misunderstood? What if his faith had somehow led him astray? The consequences of a mistake would be catastrophic, not just for him, but for all who would follow him. It was in this state of mind that Gideon made his famous request for divine confirmation. The fleece test, as it would come to be known, represented not a lack of faith, but rather a deep desire for certainty in the face of overwhelming responsibility. "If you will save Israel by my hand as you have promised," Gideon prayed earnestly, "look, I will place a wool fleece on the threshing floor. If there is dew only on the fleece, and all the ground is dry, then I will know that you will save Israel by my hand, as you said." The request was specific and measurable. In the normal course of nature, dew would form on all surfaces exposed to the night air. If God could reverse this natural process, causing moisture to collect only on the fleece, while leaving the surrounding ground completely dry, it would serve as an unmistakable sign of divine intervention. Gideon placed the fleece carefully on the threshing floor as evening approached. All through the night he must have awakened periodically, wondering what he would find in the morning. As dawn broke, he hurried to the spot where he had placed his test. What he discovered filled him with wonder and awe. The fleece was thoroughly saturated with dew, so much so that when he wrung it out, he was able to fill an entire bowl with water. Yet all around it, the ground was completely dry, as if an invisible barrier had prevented any moisture from settling anywhere but on the wool. The sign was clear and unmistakable, yet Gideon's human nature craved even greater certainty. The magnitude of what he was being called to do seemed to justify asking for additional confirmation. With remarkable humility and boldness he approached God with yet another request. "Do not be angry with me," Gideon prayed, acknowledging that his repeated testing might seem to indicate a lack of trust. "Let me make just one more request. Allow me one more test with the fleece, but this time make the fleece dry and let the ground be covered with dew." This second test was even more remarkable than the first. It would be one thing for God to cause dew to collect on a single object, while keeping the surrounding area dry, but it would be quite another to keep one small piece of wool completely dry while saturating everything around it. This second sign would demonstrate not just God's power over nature, but his precise control over the smallest details. Again, Gideon placed the fleece on the threshing floor and waited through the night. When morning came, he found exactly what he had requested. The fleece was bone dry without a trace of moisture, while the ground all around it sparkled with heavy dew. The grass, the stones, the nearby trees, everything was wet with the night's moisture, except for that one small piece of wool. God had patiently granted both requests, demonstrating not anger at Gideon's need for reassurance, but understanding and compassion for human weakness. The fleece tests revealed important truths about the nature of faith and the character of God. Faith is not the absence of questions or doubts. Rather, it is the willingness to act in obedience despite those questions and doubts. Moreover, God's response to Gideon's requests showed his patience with those who seek him earnestly. He did not rebuke Gideon for his need for confirmation, nor did he withdraw his calling because of the young man's hesitation. Instead, he graciously provided the assurance that Gideon needed to step forward in faith. The fleece tests also demonstrated the balance between seeking divine guidance and taking action. There comes a point when further testing can become an excuse for inaction, when the desire for certainty becomes a barrier to obedience. Gideon wisely limited his requests to 2 clear signs, then proceeded to act on what he'd received. As news of these miraculous signs spread throughout the tribes of Israel, hope began to stir in hearts that had been dormant for years. Perhaps God had not forgotten them after all. Perhaps deliverance was indeed coming through this unlikely young man from Ophrah. But before Gideon could lead Israel into battle against their oppressors, he would need to assemble an army. The call went out throughout the territories of Manasseh, Asher, Zebulun, and Naphtali. Men who had been hiding in caves and mountain strongholds began to emerge, drawn by the promise of freedom and the reports of God's miraculous confirmations. The response was overwhelming. 32,000 men answered the call, a substantial army by any measure. These were not professional soldiers, but farmers and craftsmen, fathers and sons, united by their hatred of oppression and their desperate hope for liberation. They came carrying whatever weapons they could find, swords that had been hidden from enemy raids, spears hastily fashioned from farming tools, bows that had been used for hunting game in the wilderness. As Gideon looked out over this vast assembly of volunteers, he might have felt a surge of confidence. Surely with 32,000 men, even amateur fighters, he could mount a credible challenge to the Midianite forces. The odds were still daunting, given that the enemy could field armies many times larger, but at least now they had a fighting chance. Yet God had other plans. The fleece tests had been preparation not just for Gideon's faith, but for an even greater demonstration of divine power. The true test was not whether Gideon could trust God with impossible signs, but whether he could trust God with an impossible strategy. What happened next would shock both Gideon and his army, challenging every human assumption about warfare and victory. God was about to demonstrate that his ways are not our ways, and that his power is made perfect, not in human strength, but in human weakness. The morning sun cast long shadows across the camp as 32,000 men prepared for what they believed would be their march to war. Weapons were sharpened, provisions were packed, and final prayers were offered. The air buzzed with nervous energy as farmers turned warriors contemplated the battle that lay ahead. Gideon moved among his troops, offering words of encouragement and trying to project the confidence that a leader must display. Yet privately, he was still awed by the magnitude of what was happening. Just weeks earlier, he had been hiding in a wine press, and now he stood at the head of the largest volunteer army Israel had assembled in generations. But as the army prepared to march toward the enemy encampment, God spoke to Gideon with words that must have sent shockwaves through his entire being. "You have too many men. I cannot deliver Midian into their hands, or Israel would boast against me. Our own strength has saved us." Too many men? The statement seemed to defy all military logic. The Midianites and their allies numbered in the hundreds of thousands. Their camels alone described as being like locusts for multitude. How could 32,000 possibly be considered too many? Yet God's reasoning revealed a profound truth about the nature of divine deliverance. If Israel won the coming battle through conventional military means, they would inevitably credit their victory to their own strength, strategy, and courage. The victory needed to be so obviously supernatural that no one could mistake its source. God's glory was at stake, and that glory could not be shared with human pride. Following God's instructions, Gideon stood before his assembled army and made an announcement that must have stunned many of the volunteers. Anyone who trembles with fear may turn back and leave Mount Gilead. The offer was based on an ancient law found in Deuteronomy, which recognised that fearful soldiers could spread panic through the ranks and actually weaken an army's effectiveness. But in this case, the dismissal served a different purpose entirely. God was beginning the process of reducing the army to a size that would make his intervention unmistakable. The response to Gideon's announcement was immediate and devastating. 22,000 men took advantage of the opportunity to withdraw from what many probably saw as a suicide mission anyway. These were not cowards in the traditional sense. They were ordinary people facing an extraordinary situation, and they chose the safety of their families over the uncertainties of battle. As Gideon watched more than 2/3 of his army walk away, his heart must have sunk. 10,000 men remained, still a respectable force, but far fewer than what seemed necessary for the task ahead. Surely now they could proceed with God's blessing. But God was not finished with his reductions. "There are still too many men," came the divine word. "Take them down to the water, and I will thin them out for you there. If I say, 'This one shall go with you,' he shall go. But if I say, 'This one shall not go with you,' he shall not go." The instruction was puzzling and specific. Gideon was to observe how the men drank water and select his final army based on their drinking method. Of all the criteria that might be used to choose warriors, how they consumed water seemed among the least relevant to military prowess. At the water's edge, the 10,000 men revealed their character through their approach to drinking. The vast majority knelt down and put their faces directly to the water, drinking deeply and focusing entirely on satisfying their thirst. But a small group, only 300 men, demonstrated a different approach. They brought water to their mouths with their hands, lapping it like dogs while maintaining their vigilance and readiness. God's instruction was clear. "With the 300 men that lapped, I will save you and give the Midianites into your hands. Let all the others go home." The reduction was complete and shocking. From 32,000 to 300 represented a decrease of more than 99%. What had begun as a substantial army was now reduced to little more than a large company. The odds, already daunting, had become mathematically absurd. Yet the selection criteria revealed profound spiritual truths. The 300 men who were chosen had demonstrated alertness, self-discipline, and readiness, even in a moment of personal need. While drinking, they had maintained their awareness of their surroundings, prepared for action at a moment's notice. These qualities, while admirable in soldiers, were really symbols of spiritual preparedness and faithfulness. As the dismissed soldiers departed, taking most of the weapons and supplies with them, Gideon was left with 300 men who looked more like a ceremonial guard than a fighting force. The enemy they faced was described in terms that emphasized their overwhelming numbers. All the Midianites, the Amalekites, and the other eastern peoples had settled in the valley, thick as locusts. Their camels could no more be counted than the sand on the seashore. The disparity was so extreme that it moved beyond the realm of military strategy into the realm of the miraculous. No human commander would voluntarily reduce his forces to such a level when facing such overwhelming odds. Yet this was precisely God's point. The victory that was coming would be so clearly divine in origin that no one could attribute it to human planning or prowess. For Gideon, this final reduction must have been the ultimate test of faith. Everything in his military thinking, everything in his natural instincts, everything in conventional wisdom screamed against such a strategy. Yet his experiences with the fleece had prepared him for this moment. He had learned to trust God's ways even when they contradicted human logic. The 300 men who remained showed remarkable faith as well. They could see the enemy forces spread across the valley below them. They knew the odds better than anyone, yet they chose to stay, to trust in the God who had called them through his servant Gideon. As night fell over the Israelite camp, the 300 men prepared for what would be the most unconventional battle in military history. They had no idea that they were about to participate in a victory that would be remembered and celebrated for thousands of years. A victory that would demonstrate God's power to use the weak to confound the mighty. The stage was set for a night that would change everything. The Midianites slept in their countless tents, confident in their overwhelming superiority. The 300 Israelites made their final preparations, trusting in a God who specialized in impossible victories. The hours before dawn are often the darkest, both literally and figuratively. As Gideon and his 300 men crouched in the hills overlooking the vast enemy encampment, the weight of their impossible mission pressed down upon them like a physical burden. The valley below was filled with the tents of their enemies, stretching as far as the eye could see in the starlight, a sea of canvas that housed an army larger than any they had ever faced. Despite the miraculous signs he had witnessed and the divine assurances he had received, Gideon still struggled with doubt. God, in his infinite understanding of human nature, provided one more confirmation before the battle commenced. "Get up, go down against the camp," the Lord instructed, "because I am going to give it into your hands. If you are afraid to attack, go down to the camp with your servant Purah and listen to what they are saying. Afterward, you will be encouraged to attack the camp." The offer revealed God's compassionate understanding of Gideon's anxiety. Rather than rebuking him for his continued fears, the Lord provided an opportunity for reassurance. Taking his servant Purah with him, Gideon crept down toward the perimeter of the enemy camp under cover of darkness. The Midianite camp was massive beyond imagination. Thousands upon thousands of tents housed warriors from multiple nations united in their conquest of Israel. The sounds of the sleeping army filled the night air, snoring soldiers, restless camels, the occasional challenge of sentries. The very scale of the enemy forces should have been overwhelming to any reasonable observer. As Gideon and Purah approached the outer edge of the camp, they overheard a conversation between two Midianite soldiers. One was telling his companion about a disturbing dream he had experienced. "I had a dream. A round loaf of barley bread came tumbling into the Midianite camp. It struck the tent with such force that the tent overturned and collapsed." The interpretation offered by his fellow soldier was even more remarkable. "This can be nothing other than the sword of Gideon, son of Joash, the Israelite. God has given the Midianites and the whole camp into his hands." The irony was profound. Here in the heart of the enemy camp, God was providing confirmation through the mouths of Israel's oppressors themselves. The barley bread in the dream was significant. Barley was considered the food of the poor, inferior to wheat. Yet in the dream, this humble loaf had the power to destroy the entire enemy position. The symbolism was clear. God would use the humble and despised to bring down the mighty and proud. That Gideon's name was already known to the enemy indicated that word of the gathering Israelite resistance had reached their ears. Rather than being encouraged by their overwhelming numerical superiority, some among the Midianites were apparently experiencing anxiety about this upstart Hebrew leader. God was already working in the hearts and minds of the enemy, preparing them for defeat. Gideon and Purah retreated to their own lines, hearts pounding with excitement and renewed confidence. The doubt that had plagued Gideon was finally dispelled by this remarkable confirmation. When they reached the Israelite position, Gideon called his men together for final instructions. "Get up," he announced with newfound authority and confidence. "The Lord has given the Midianite camp into your hands." What followed was perhaps the most unusual battle plan in military history. Instead of swords and spears, Gideon distributed trumpets, empty clay jars, and torches to each of his 300 men. The weapons of conventional warfare were set aside in favour of items that seemed more suited to a religious ceremony than a military campaign. Gideon divided his small force into 3 companies of 100 men each. The strategy was simple, yet audacious. They would surround the enemy camp and, at Gideon's signal, create as much noise and confusion as possible while giving the appearance of a much larger force. "Watch me," Gideon instructed his men. "Follow my lead. When I get to the edge of the camp, do exactly as I do. When I and all who are with me blow our trumpets, then from all around the camp blow yours and shout, 'For the Lord and for Gideon.'" The plan required perfect timing and coordination. Each man would conceal his torch inside a clay jar, maintaining complete darkness and silence until the moment of attack. Then at Gideon's signal, they would simultaneously break their jars, revealing blazing torches, blow their trumpets with all their might, and shout their battle cry. The psychological impact was designed to be devastating. The enemy would suddenly find themselves surrounded by lights and noise, creating the impression of a massive attacking force. In the confusion of a night assault, with limited visibility and the disorientation of being awakened from sleep, even experienced soldiers could panic and lose their sense of direction. As the 3 companies moved into position around the vast perimeter of the enemy camp, each man must have felt the weight of the moment. They were not professional soldiers, but ordinary citizens who had answered the call to fight for their freedom. Now they found themselves in the most critical moment of their lives, armed with the most unconventional weapons imaginable, trusting in a God who had promised victory through seemingly impossible means. The middle watch around midnight was traditionally the time when sentries were changed, and vigilance was often at its lowest point. It was at this precise moment that Gideon and his 100 men reached their assigned position on the edge of the camp. Across the valley, 200 other men waited in similar positions, every eye fixed on their leader for the signal that would begin the battle. Gideon raised his torch-filled jar high above his head, then brought it down sharply, smashing it against a rock. The clay shattered with a sound that seemed to echo across the silent valley, and immediately his torch blazed forth in the darkness. At the same instant, he lifted his trumpet to his lips and blew a long, piercing blast. "For the Lord and for Gideon," he shouted at the top of his lungs. The signal rippled around the camp as 300 jars smashed simultaneously. 300 torches burst into flame, and 300 trumpet heads sounded their defiant call. The battle cry of "For the Lord and for Gideon" echoed from every direction, creating the impression that the Midianite camp was completely surrounded by a massive army. The effect was instantaneous and devastating. Thousands of sleeping soldiers were jolted awake to find their camp surrounded by blazing lights and deafening noise. In the confusion and darkness, panic spread like wildfire through the ranks. Soldiers stumbled from their tents, grabbing whatever weapons they could find, unable to determine the size or direction of the attacking force. In their panic and confusion, the Midianites and their allies began attacking each other. Unable to distinguish friend from foe in the darkness, and hearing battle cries in their own languages from every direction, they assumed they had been betrayed by their allies. The coalition that had seemed so formidable began to tear itself apart. The 300 Israelites maintained their positions around the perimeter, continuing to blow their trumpets and hold their torches high, creating the illusion of a massive army that had the enemy completely surrounded. They watched in amazement as God fulfilled his promise in the most spectacular fashion imaginable. The panic spread throughout the entire camp like a plague. What had begun as confusion quickly escalated into a full-scale rout as the enemy forces fled in every direction, abandoning their weapons, supplies, and even their camels in their desperate attempt to escape what they perceived as certain destruction. The victory was complete and overwhelming, achieved not through superior numbers or military might, but through divine intervention, working through the obedience of 300 faithful men. The God who had called Gideon from his hiding place in the winepress had once again demonstrated that his power is made perfect in human weakness. As dawn broke over the valley, an astonishing sight greeted the 300 Israelites. Where the night before had stood the mighty encampment of Israel's oppressors, now lay only scattered debris and abandoned supplies. Tents stood empty, their guy ropes cut by fleeing soldiers. Weapons lay discarded where they had fallen from panicked hands. The camels that had been described as innumerable as locusts wandered aimlessly, their owners having fled into the wilderness. The ground itself told the story of the night's chaos. Bloodstains marked the spots where confused allies had struck down one another in the darkness. Personal belongings were strewn across the landscape as the fleeing army had abandoned everything that might slow their escape. The scene looked less like the aftermath of a battle and more like the remnants of a catastrophic natural disaster. Gideon and his men moved through the abandoned camp in wonder, scarcely believing what their eyes were witnessing. The victory was so complete, so overwhelming, that it seemed almost too good to be true. Yet the evidence was undeniable. The army that had terrorized Israel for 7 years had been routed by 300 men armed with trumpets and torches. But God's deliverance was not yet complete. Even as the 300 marvelled at what had occurred in the valley, word of the miraculous victory was spreading throughout the hill country of Israel. Men who had dismissed Gideon's call to arms, who had remained hidden in their caves and strongholds, now emerged with renewed courage and determination. The tribes of Naphtali, Asher and Manasseh rallied to pursue the fleeing Midianites. What had begun with 300 faithful men now swelled into a national movement of liberation. The psychological impact of the victory was as important as the military result. The myth of Midianite invincibility had been shattered in a single night, and the spirit of resistance that had been dormant for so long now burst forth like a river breaking through a dam. Gideon sent messengers throughout the hill country of Ephraim with urgent instructions. Come down against the Midianites and seize the waters of the Jordan ahead of them as far as Beth-barah. This strategic move would cut off the enemy's escape routes and ensure that the victory would be complete. The Ephraimites responded with enthusiasm, capturing the fords of the Jordan and trapping many of the fleeing Midianites. In the pursuit that followed, they captured 2 of the Midianite leaders, Oreb and Zeb, whose names meant raven and wolf. These princes, who had struck terror into Israelite hearts for years, were now defeated and killed at the places that would forever bear their names: the rock of Oreb and the winepress of Zeb. The pursuit continued beyond the Jordan as Gideon and his original 300, though exhausted, pressed on to capture the remaining Midianite kings, Zaba and Zalmunna. The victory was total and decisive. An empire that had dominated the region for 7 years was completely destroyed in a matter of days. The land of Israel enjoyed peace for 40 years during Gideon's lifetime. The oppression that had driven families into hiding was replaced by prosperity and security. Fields that had been abandoned were cultivated again. Markets that had stood empty bustled with commerce. Children who had grown up knowing only fear could now play freely in their villages. But perhaps the greatest victory was not military but spiritual. Israel had rediscovered that their God was still the same mighty deliverer who had brought their ancestors out of Egypt. The impossible victory served as a permanent reminder that with God all things are possible. The story of Gideon and the 300 speaks across the centuries, with timeless truths that challenge and encourage us today. First, we see that God uses the unlikely. Gideon was not a seasoned warrior or a natural leader. He was a fearful farmer, hiding from his enemies. Yet God saw potential that others missed. This reminds us that God's calling is not based on our qualifications, but on his purposes. Second, the reduction of Gideon's army from 32,000 to 300 demonstrates that faith matters more than numbers. In a world obsessed with statistics and metrics, God's economy operates differently. He delights in using small faithful remnants to accomplish great things, ensuring that his power, not human strength, receives the glory. Third, Gideon's requests for signs teach us about the balance between faith and doubt. God was patient with Gideon's need for confirmation, showing us that honest questions and requests for reassurance are not signs of weak faith but of a heart that desires to walk in God's will. Finally, the story shows us that obedience in the face of fear is the essence of courage. Gideon was afraid, his army was outnumbered, and the strategy seemed foolish. Yet they obeyed, and God honoured their faithfulness with victory. When we feel unqualified for the tasks before us, when the odds seem insurmountable, when we need reassurance before taking steps of faith, the story of Gideon reminds us that our God specialises in impossible victories. He is still calling ordinary people to extraordinary purposes, still using the weak to confound the mighty, still turning fearful hearts into faithful warriors. The God who met Gideon at the winepress is the same God who meets us in our hiding places today, calling us to step out in faith and watch him work miracles through surrendered lives. Just as the 300 trumpets and torches became instruments of divine victory, our simple obedience can become the means through which God accomplishes his purposes in our generation. May we have the courage to answer when he calls, the faith to trust when he leads, and the persistence to follow when he sends us into battles that seem impossible to win. For with God, the 300 can defeat the multitudes, and faith can move mountains that seem immovable. The story of Gideon reminds us that our greatest victories come not when we feel strong and capable, but when we acknowledge our weakness and depend completely on God's strength. In those moments of surrender, we discover that we serve a God who delights in doing the impossible through the most unlikely people. And so the story ends where it began, with an invitation to faith, a call to courage, and a promise that the God who delivered Israel through Gideon and the 300 is still delivering his people today, one impossible victory at a...
Hello dear friends, and welcome to Sacred Slumber. Before we begin this beautiful journey together, I'd love to connect with you for just a moment. How has your day been? Whether it's morning, afternoon or evening where you are in the world, I hope this story finds you in a peaceful place, ready to receive some comfort and inspiration. No matter what corner of the globe you're listening from, you're part of our Sacred Slumber family. If you haven't already, please consider subscribing to Sacred Slumber for more stories like this one that will nourish your soul and bring peace to your heart. Tonight, we're going to journey together through one of the most remarkable stories ever told, the true account of Joseph, a young man whose life teaches us profound lessons about resilience, faith, and the mysterious ways that purpose unfolds even in our darkest moments. This is a story that has inspired millions across centuries, reminding us that no matter how deep our pit may seem, there's always hope for palace moments ahead. In the ancient land of Canaan, where the sun painted golden hues across rolling hills dotted with olive trees and grazing flocks, there lived a patriarch named Jacob. His tents were pitched near Hebron, and his wealth was measured not in gold or silver, but in the size of his herds and the strength of his family. Jacob had 12 sons, but among them all one held a special place in his father's heart. Joseph was 17 years old, with eyes that sparkled with intelligence and a spirit that seemed to dance with dreams. He was the son of Rachel, Jacob's but loved wife, who had died giving birth to Benjamin, Joseph's younger brother. Perhaps it was the memory of Rachel that made Jacob's love for Joseph burn so brightly, or perhaps it was something else, a recognition of the extraordinary destiny that seemed to hover around this particular son like morning mist around a mountain peak. The favouritism was evident to everyone in the household. While Joseph's older brothers, Reuben, Simeon, Levi, Judah, Dan, Naphtali, Gad, Asher, Issachar and Zebulun worked hard in the fields tending the flocks, Joseph often remained close to home. His brothers wore the simple, practical garments of shepherds, but Joseph wore something entirely different. One day Jacob called Joseph to his tent. The old man's hands, weathered by years of labour and life, held a garment that took Joseph's breath away. It was a coat of many colours, rich blues like the depths of the sea, vibrant reds like the sunset over the desert, brilliant yellows like fields of grain, and deep purples like the robes of kings. The fabric was fine, the workmanship exquisite. It was not the coat of a shepherd, but the robe of a prince. "My son," Jacob said, his voice thick with emotion as he placed the coat on Joseph's shoulders, "this is for you. You are precious to me beyond measure." Joseph felt the weight of the coat, but more than that, he felt the weight of his father's love and the unspoken promise it contained. As he walked among his brothers wearing this magnificent garment, he could feel their eyes following him, eyes that had grown cold with resentment and hard with jealousy. But the coat was only the beginning. Joseph had always been a dreamer, but now his dreams took on a quality that was both wonderful and troubling. One morning, as the family gathered for their meal, Joseph could no longer contain the vision that had visited him in the night. "Listen to this dream I had," Joseph said, his voice bright with excitement and innocence. "We were binding sheaves of grain out in the field, when suddenly my sheaf rose and stood upright, while your sheaves gathered around mine and bowed down to it." The silence that followed was deafening. His brothers exchanged glances that spoke volumes. Reuben's jaw tightened. Simeon's hands clenched into fists. Judah shook his head in disgust. "Do you intend to reign over us?" Simeon asked, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "Will you actually rule us?" But Joseph, in his youthful enthusiasm, seemed oblivious to the storm clouds gathering around him. Soon after he had another dream, even more vivid than the first. "Listen," he said one evening as the family sat around the fire, the flames casting dancing shadows on their faces. "I had another dream, and this time the sun and moon and 11 stars were bowing down to me." Even Jacob was troubled by this dream. "What is this dream you had?" he asked, his voice carrying a note of concern. "Will your mother and I and your brothers actually come and bow down to the ground before you?" Though Jacob rebuked Joseph publicly, privately he pondered these words in his heart. There was something about his son's dreams that felt different from ordinary night visions. They carried the weight of prophecy, the sense of divine purpose. But for Joseph's brothers, these dreams were the final straw. Their hatred for Joseph grew like a cancer, fed by jealousy and watered by resentment. The brothers could hardly speak a civil word to Joseph anymore. When he approached, conversation stopped. When he tried to join their work, they found reasons to send him away. The coat of many colours became a symbol of everything they despised about their father's favouritism and their brother's apparent arrogance. One day, Jacob sent Joseph to check on his brothers who were grazing the flocks near Dothan, several days' journey from home. As Joseph set out, wearing his beautiful coat and carrying provisions for his brothers, he had no idea that he was walking toward a destiny that would change not only his life, but the course of history itself. The brothers saw him coming from a long distance, the colours of his coat visible even across the rolling hills. As that familiar figure approached, the resentment that had been building for years finally reached its boiling point. "Here comes that dreamer," one of them said with venom. "Let's kill him," another suggested. "We can throw him into one of these cisterns and say that a ferocious animal devoured him. Then we'll see what comes of his dreams." For a moment, murder hung in the air like a storm cloud ready to burst. But Reuben, the eldest, felt the weight of responsibility on his shoulders. "Let's not take his life," he said quickly. "Throw him into this cistern here in the wilderness, but don't lay a hand on him." Privately, Reuben planned to rescue Joseph later and return him to their father. When Joseph finally reached his brothers, he greeted them with a smile, completely unaware of the dark thoughts that had been brewing in their hearts. But instead of the warm welcome he expected, they seized him roughly. Hands that should have embraced him tore at his beautiful coat, stripping it from his body. Before he could fully comprehend what was happening, they had grabbed him and thrown him into an empty cistern. The pit was deep and dry, its walls smooth stone that offered no hope of escape. As Joseph hit the bottom, the breath knocked from his lungs. He looked up to see the circle of sky above growing smaller as his brothers walked away. The silence was overwhelming. One moment he had been walking free under the open sky, and the next he was trapped in a hole in the ground, abandoned by his own family. Above him, his brothers sat down to eat their meal as if nothing had happened. The casual way they consumed their bread and cheese while their brother suffered below spoke volumes about how completely their hearts had been hardened by jealousy. But God's purposes are rarely thwarted by human cruelty, and even as Joseph sat in that pit, wondering if he would die there, divine providence was already at work. In the distance, a caravan of Ishmaelite traders appeared on the horizon, their camels loaded with spices, balm and myrrh bound for Egypt. Judah, perhaps feeling some stirring of conscience, looked at his brothers and said, "What will we gain if we kill our brother and cover up his blood? Come, let's sell him to the Ishmaelites and not lay our hands on him. After all, he is our brother, our own flesh and blood." The brothers agreed, seeing an opportunity to rid themselves of Joseph while making a profit. They pulled Joseph out of the cistern and sold him to the traders for 20 shekels of silver. As the caravan disappeared into the distance with Joseph bound among the slaves, the brothers took his coat of many colours and tore it. Then they killed a goat and dipped the coat in its blood. When they returned home, they presented the bloodied coat to their father. "We found this," they said. "Examine it to see whether it is your son's robe." Jacob recognized it immediately. The colours that had once brought him such joy now brought only anguish. "It is my son's robe," he cried. "Some ferocious animal has devoured him. Joseph has surely been torn to pieces." Jacob tore his clothes in grief and put on sackcloth. He mourned for his son many days, and though all his sons and daughters came to comfort him, he refused to be comforted. "No," he said, "I will continue to mourn until I join my son in the grave." Meanwhile, the caravan carrying Joseph continued its journey toward Egypt, each step taking him further from everything he had ever known and loved. As the young man looked back at the fading hills of his homeland, he could not have imagined that this betrayal, this moment that felt like the end of everything, was actually the beginning of a story that would demonstrate the power of God to bring beauty from ashes and purpose from pain. The journey to Egypt was long and grueling. Joseph, who had never known anything but comfort and privilege, now found himself chained among slaves, his feet bloody from walking across rough terrain, his throat parched from the desert sun. The traders were not cruel, but neither were they kind. He was simply merchandise to them, a commodity to be delivered in good condition to fetch the best price. As the caravan crested the final hill before entering Egypt, Joseph's eyes widened at the sight before him. Egypt was unlike anything he had ever seen. The Nile River stretched like a blue ribbon through the landscape, its banks lined with lush green vegetation that stood in stark contrast to the golden desert beyond. Pyramids rose majestically in the distance, monuments to the power and sophistication of this ancient civilization. The cities teemed with activity, merchants hawking their wares, craftsmen plying their trades, and everywhere the bustle of a society that had mastered the art of turning the desert into a garden. In the slave market of Memphis, Joseph stood with the others as potential buyers examined them like livestock. His youth and obvious intelligence caught the eye of several bidders, but it was Potiphar, an officer of Pharaoh and captain of the guard, who ultimately purchased him. Potiphar was a man of considerable wealth and influence, with a household that required numerous servants to maintain its operations. Joseph's new life began in Potiphar's house, where he was assigned to work among the other servants. Everything about his circumstances had changed. He who had once worn a coat of many colours now dressed in the simple linen of a slave. He who had once been served was now serving others. He who had once been the favoured son was now property, with no rights and no freedom. But something remarkable happened in Potiphar's house. Instead of becoming bitter or despondent, Joseph chose to serve with excellence. When he was given a task, he completed it better than anyone expected. When he was assigned to care for something, he treated it as if it were his own. His attitude was not that of a man who had been wronged, but of someone who understood that his character was more important than his circumstances. It didn't take long for Potiphar to notice this exceptional young man. While other servants did only what was required of them, Joseph anticipated needs before they were expressed. He learned the Egyptian language with remarkable speed, mastered the customs of the household, and demonstrated an administrative ability that was far beyond his years. Most importantly, there was something about Joseph's presence that seemed to bring blessing wherever he went. Potiphar began to entrust Joseph with greater responsibilities. First, he made him his personal attendant. Then he put him in charge of his household affairs. Before long, Joseph was managing all of Potiphar's possessions, his property, his servants, his business dealings. The Egyptian captain of the guard had never seen anything like it. Everything that Joseph touched seemed to prosper. Years passed, and Joseph grew from a teenager into a handsome young man. The hardships he had endured had not broken him, but had instead forged him into someone of remarkable character and capability. Potiphar trusted him completely, to the point where he concerned himself with nothing except the food he ate. Everything else was in Joseph's capable hands. But success and favour can sometimes bring their own dangers, and Joseph was about to face a test that would prove even more challenging than the pit his brothers had thrown him into. Potiphar's wife had noticed the young Hebrew slave who had risen to such prominence in her household. Joseph was not only capable and trustworthy, but he had grown into a man of striking appearance. Day after day she watched him as he went about his duties with quiet dignity and remarkable competence. Soon, watching was not enough. "Come to bed with me," she said to Joseph one day when they found themselves alone. Joseph was stunned by her proposition. The wife of his master, a woman of rank and privilege, was propositioning a slave. But Joseph's response revealed the depth of his character and the strength of his convictions. "No," he said firmly but respectfully. "With me in charge, my master does not concern himself with anything in the house. Everything he owns he has entrusted to my care. No one is greater in this house than I am. My master has withheld nothing from me except you, because you are his wife. How then could I do such a wicked thing and sin against God?" Day after day she spoke to Joseph, but he refused to go to bed with her or even to be with her. Joseph understood that betraying Potiphar's trust would not only be wrong, but it would also be a sin against the God who had been with him through all his trials. His integrity was not for sale, regardless of the price or the pressure. But a person determined to do wrong will often become vindictive when their advances are rejected. Potiphar's wife's desire turned to anger, and her anger to a determination for revenge. She waited for the right opportunity, and one day when Joseph came into the house to attend to his duties, and none of the household servants were inside, she made her move. She caught him by his cloak and said, "Come to bed with me." But Joseph left his cloak in her hand and ran out of the house. Holding his cloak as evidence, Potiphar's wife called to the household servants. "Look," she said, "this Hebrew has been brought to us to make sport of us. He came in here to sleep with me, but I screamed. When he heard me scream for help, he left his cloak beside me and ran out of the house." When Potiphar came home, his wife told him the same story. "That Hebrew slave you brought us came to me to make sport of me, but as soon as I screamed for help, he left his cloak beside me and ran out of the house." Potiphar burned with anger. The man he had trusted above all others, the servant who had brought such blessing to his household, had apparently betrayed that trust in the worst possible way. Without investigation, without hearing Joseph's side of the story, Potiphar had Joseph seized and thrown into prison, the same prison where the king's prisoners were confined. Once again, Joseph found himself in a pit, though this time it was made of stone and iron rather than earth. Once again, he had been betrayed by those he had served faithfully. Once again, his circumstances had changed dramatically through no fault of his own. He had done the right thing, had maintained his integrity, had honoured God, and his reward was imprisonment for a crime he had not committed. Many people would have become bitter at this point. They would have questioned why God allowed such injustice, why faithfulness seemed to be rewarded with suffering. They might have decided that integrity was not worth the cost, that doing right was foolish when it led to such consequences. But Joseph was not like most people. Even in prison, even after being falsely accused and unjustly punished, something within him refused to give up hope. He had learned that his circumstances did not define him, his character did. He had discovered that God's presence was not dependent on favourable conditions, but was available even in the darkest places. And remarkably, even in prison, Joseph began to prosper. The warden noticed this unusual prisoner who carried himself with such dignity, who treated others with such respect, who seemed to bring order and blessing wherever he went. Before long, the warden put Joseph in charge of all the other prisoners and made him responsible for all that was done in the prison. The warden paid no attention to anything under Joseph's care because the Lord was with Joseph and gave him success in whatever he did. Once again, Joseph had taken a situation that seemed hopeless and had found a way to serve with excellence, to lead with integrity, and to trust that somehow, in ways he could not yet see, God was working all things together for good. But the greatest tests of Joseph's faith were still ahead, and the prison that seemed like an ending was actually preparing him for a beginning that would astonish the world. Prison has a way of stripping away everything except what truly matters. In the Egyptian jail where Joseph now found himself, surrounded by stone walls and iron bars, the external trappings of success and status meant nothing. Here, in this place reserved for those who had supposedly committed crimes against Pharaoh, Joseph faced the ultimate test of his character. Days turned into months, and months into years. Joseph had now spent more time as a slave and prisoner than he had as the favoured son in his father's house. The dreams of his youth, the sheaves bowing down, the sun and moon and stars paying homage, seemed like the fantasies of another lifetime. If someone had asked him during those long, dark nights whether he still believed in those dreams, he might have wondered himself. But Joseph had learned something profound during his years of hardship, that faith is not about understanding God's timeline, but about trusting God's character. He had seen evidence of divine favour even in the darkest circumstances. When he was in Potiphar's house, God had blessed his work. Now, even in prison, he could see the same pattern. Blessing flowing through him to benefit others. Success following him, even in the most unlikely places. The other prisoners noticed something different about Joseph. While many of them spent their time in despair, anger, or plotting revenge, Joseph maintained a remarkable sense of peace. He listened to their stories with compassion, helped resolve disputes with wisdom, and carried himself with a dignity that prison walls could not diminish. The warden had made him the unofficial leader among the prisoners, and everyone, guards and inmates alike, respected him. One morning, Joseph noticed that two of his fellow prisoners seemed particularly troubled. They were not ordinary criminals, but former members of Pharaoh's household, the chief cupbearer and the chief baker. Both had been imprisoned for offences against their royal master, and both carried themselves with the dignity of men, accustomed to positions of privilege and responsibility. "Why do you look so sad today?" Joseph asked them. The cupbearer answered, "We both had dreams, but there is no one to interpret them." In the ancient world, dreams were considered messages from the gods. and their interpretation was a specialized skill typically reserved for trained priests and wise men. To have a significant dream and no way to understand its meaning was a source of genuine distress. Joseph's response revealed both his humility and his faith. Do not interpretations belong to God? Tell me your dreams. The chief cupbearer went first. In my dream, he said, I saw a vine in front of me, and on the vine were 3 branches. As soon as it budded, it blossomed, and its clusters ripened into grapes. Pharaoh's cup was in my hand, and I took the grapes, squeezed them into Pharaoh's cup, and put the cup in his hand. Joseph listened carefully, and as the cupbearer spoke, understanding came to him with a clarity that felt like sunrise after a long night. This is what it means, Joseph said. The 3 branches are 3 days. Within 3 days, Pharaoh will lift up your head and restore you to your position, and you will put Pharaoh's cup in his hand, just as you used to do when you were his cupbearer. The cupbearer's face lit up with hope. Joseph continued, But when all goes well with you, remember me and show me kindness. Mention me to Pharaoh and get me out of this prison. I was forcibly carried off from the land of the Hebrews, and even here I have done nothing to deserve being put in a dungeon. When the chief baker saw that Joseph had given a favourable interpretation to the cupbearer's dream, he eagerly shared his own vision. I too had a dream, he said. On my head were 3 baskets of bread. In the top basket were all kinds of baked goods for Pharaoh, but the birds were eating them out of the basket on my head. Joseph's expression grew grave as he received understanding of this dream as well. The interpretation was not pleasant, but Joseph knew he had to speak the truth. This is what it means, he said gently. The 3 baskets are 3 days. Within 3 days, Pharaoh will lift off your head and impale your body on a pole, and the birds will eat away your flesh. 3 days later, it was Pharaoh's birthday, and he gave a feast for all his officials. He lifted up the heads of the chief cupbearer and the chief baker in the presence of his officials. He restored the chief cupbearer to his position, so that he once again put the cup into Pharaoh's hand. But he impaled the chief baker, just as Joseph had said to them in his interpretation. The accuracy of Joseph's interpretation should have marked him as a man of extraordinary ability, someone worthy of attention and favour. The chief cupbearer had been restored to his position of influence, with direct access to the most powerful man in Egypt. Surely he would remember the prisoner who had correctly interpreted his dream and had specifically asked to be remembered. But the chief cupbearer forgot about Joseph. This forgetting was perhaps one of the most difficult trials Joseph had yet faced. It was not the active betrayal of his brothers or the false accusation of Potiphar's wife, but the passive neglect of someone who simply failed to keep his word. Day after day, Joseph waited, hoping that this would be the day when guards would come to release him, when word would arrive that Pharaoh wanted to see him. But the days passed in silence. Months turned into a year, and then another year. 2 full years passed, and still the cupbearer, busy with his restored duties and privileges, did not remember the Hebrew slave who had correctly interpreted his dream. It was as if Joseph had been forgotten not just by one man, but by the entire world. During these 2 years of waiting, Joseph could have become bitter. He could have concluded that helping others was pointless, that kindness was wasted on those who would not return it. He could have decided that his gift for interpreting dreams was worthless if it could not even secure his own freedom. Many people would have given up hope entirely. But Joseph continued to trust, continued to serve, continued to maintain his character even when it seemed to bring no reward. He understood something that many people never learn, that our calling is to be faithful, not to control outcomes. His job was to use his gifts with integrity and kindness. God's job was to handle the timing and the results. In the darkness of those 2 forgotten years, Joseph's faith was refined like gold in a furnace. The dreams of his youth were still alive within him, but they had been purified of any pride or presumption. He was learning that God's promises are always fulfilled, but rarely on our timeline or in the way we expect. And unbeknownst to Joseph, his time of preparation was nearly complete. All the lessons he had learned, about integrity under pressure, about leadership in difficult circumstances, about maintaining faith when it seemed unrewarded, were about to be put to their ultimate test. The pit had prepared him for the palace. But first he would need to prove that he was ready for both the privilege and the responsibility that awaited him. The stage was being set for one of the most dramatic turnarounds in human history, and the forgotten prisoner was about to become the second most powerful man in the greatest empire on earth. Pharaoh stood on the balcony of his palace, looking out over the magnificent kingdom that stretched as far as the eye could see. The Nile flowed majestically past the royal residence, its waters reflecting the first light of dawn. Egypt was at the height of its power and prosperity, with abundant harvests, thriving trade, and monuments that would stand for millennia as testaments to its greatness. But on this particular morning, Pharaoh was deeply troubled. For 2 nights in a row he had been visited by dreams so vivid and disturbing that they left him unable to rest. These were not ordinary dreams. They carried the weight of divine communication, the sense that the gods were trying to tell him something of vital importance. But what? The first dream had been strange and unsettling. Pharaoh had dreamed he was standing by the Nile when 7 cows, fat and sleek, came up out of the river and began grazing among the reeds. Then 7 other cows came up out of the river after them, but these were ugly and gaunt, more wasted and emaciated than any cattle Pharaoh had ever seen in all of Egypt. The ugly, gaunt cows ate up the 7 fat, sleek cows, but even after eating them they looked just as ugly and gaunt as before. The second dream was equally mysterious. This time Pharaoh saw 7 heads of grain growing on a single stalk, healthy and good. Then 7 other heads sprouted after them, but these were thin and scorched by the east wind. The thin heads of grain swallowed up the 7 healthy full heads. Pharaoh woke from each dream with a sense of foreboding that he could not shake. These dreams meant something, but what? He immediately called for all the magicians and wise men of Egypt, men who were trained in the ancient arts of dream interpretation and divine communication. They came quickly at their king's summons, eager to demonstrate their wisdom and earn royal favour. But as Pharaoh recounted his dreams to them, something unprecedented happened. These men, who had built their reputations on their ability to interpret dreams and divine the will of the gods, were completely baffled. They offered various theories and possibilities, but none of them carried the ring of truth. Pharaoh could sense their uncertainty, their fumbling attempts to provide answers they simply did not have. It was in this moment of royal frustration and growing anxiety that the chief cupbearer suddenly remembered something, or rather someone, he had forgotten for 2 long years. "Today I'm reminded of my shortcomings," the cupbearer said, approaching Pharaoh with obvious embarrassment. "Pharaoh was once angry with his servants, and he imprisoned me and the chief baker in the house of the captain of the guard. Each of us had a dream the same night, and each dream had a meaning of its own. Now a young Hebrew was there with us, a servant of the captain of the guard. We told him our dreams, and he interpreted them for us, giving each man the interpretation of his dream, and things turned out exactly as he interpreted them to us. I was restored to my position, and the other man was impaled." Pharaoh's eyes sharpened with interest. A Hebrew slave who could interpret dreams with perfect accuracy, when his own wise men were stumped. "Send for him immediately," Pharaoh commanded. Guards rushed to the prison and found Joseph. "Pharaoh wants to see you," they announced. "Quickly, make yourself presentable." Joseph could hardly believe what he was hearing. After more than a decade in Egypt, first as a slave, then as a prisoner, he was suddenly being summoned to appear before the most powerful man on earth. He shaved, changed his clothes, and tried to prepare himself mentally for whatever was about to happen. As Joseph was led into the royal presence, he could not help but be awed by the magnificence that surrounded him. The palace was a testament to Egypt's wealth and sophistication, with soaring columns, intricate carvings, and precious metals gleaming everywhere. Pharaoh himself sat on a throne that seemed to embody the power and mystery of the gods, dressed in robes that spoke of unimaginable authority. "I had a dream," Pharaoh said without preamble, "and no one can interpret it. But I have heard it said of you that when you hear a dream you can interpret it." Joseph's response revealed the humility and faith that had sustained him through all his trials. "I cannot do it," Joseph replied, "but God will give Pharaoh the answer he desires." This was a remarkable statement for several reasons. First, Joseph gave no credit to himself, acknowledging that any ability he had came from God. Second, he was confident that God would provide the interpretation, even though he had not yet heard the dreams. Third, he was willing to stand before the most powerful man on earth and speak about his Hebrew God, a courageous act that could have had serious consequences if Pharaoh had taken offence. Pharaoh proceeded to tell Joseph both of his dreams in detail, describing the fat and gaunt cows, the healthy and withered grain. As he spoke, Joseph listened with the same careful attention he had given to the dreams of his fellow prisoners years earlier. When Pharaoh finished, Joseph spoke with clarity and confidence that amazed everyone present. "The dreams of Pharaoh are one and the same," he said. "God has revealed to Pharaoh what he's about to do. The 7 good cows are 7 years, and the 7 good heads of grain are 7 years. It is one and the same dream. The 7 lean, ugly cows that came up afterward are 7 years, and so are the 7 worthless heads of grain scorched by the east wind. They are 7 years of famine." Joseph continued, his voice carrying the authority of divine revelation. "It is just as I said to Pharaoh. God has shown Pharaoh what he's about to do. 7 years of great abundance are coming throughout the land of Egypt, but 7 years of famine will follow them. Then all the abundance in Egypt will be forgotten, and the famine will ravage the land. The abundance in the land will not be remembered, because the famine that follows it will be so severe. The reason the dream was given to Pharaoh in 2 forms is that the matter has been firmly decided by God, and God will do it soon." But Joseph did not stop with the interpretation. Drawing on his years of experience in administration and his natural wisdom, he offered practical advice for dealing with the crisis that was coming. "And now let Pharaoh look for a discerning and wise man and put him in charge of the land of Egypt. Let Pharaoh appoint commissioners over the land to take 1/5 of the harvest of Egypt during the 7 years of abundance. They should collect all the food of these good years that are coming and store up the grain under the authority of Pharaoh, to be kept in the cities for food. This food should be held in reserve for the country, to be used during the 7 years of famine that will come upon Egypt, so that the country may not be ruined by the famine." The plan was brilliant in its simplicity and scope. During the 7 years of abundance, Egypt would systematically store 1/5 of each harvest. This would require massive organisational skills, enormous storage facilities, and careful distribution networks. It would be one of the most ambitious administrative undertakings in human history. Pharaoh and his officials were amazed not only by the interpretation, which had the unmistakable ring of truth, but also by the comprehensive plan Joseph had outlined. Here was a man who could not only understand divine communication, but could also translate that understanding into practical action. "Can we find anyone like this man?" Pharaoh asked his officials. "One in whom is the Spirit of God?" Then Pharaoh said to Joseph, "Since God has made all this known to you, there is no one so discerning and wise as you. You shall be in charge of my palace, and all my people are to submit to your orders. Only with respect to the throne will I be greater than you." And so, in a single day, Joseph went from being a forgotten prisoner to being the 2nd most powerful man in Egypt. Pharaoh took his signet ring from his finger and put it on Joseph's finger. He dressed him in robes of fine linen and put a gold chain around his neck. He had him ride in a chariot as his second in command, and people shouted before him, "Make way!" Pharaoh also gave Joseph an Egyptian name, Zaphenath-Paneah, and gave him Asenath, the daughter of Potiphera, priest of On, to be his wife. Joseph was 30 years old when he entered the service of Pharaoh, king of Egypt. 13 years had passed since his brothers had thrown him into that pit in Dothan. 13 years of slavery, false accusation, imprisonment, and being forgotten. But now those years of preparation were revealed as exactly that. Preparation for a responsibility that would affect not just Egypt, but the entire known world. As Joseph began his new role, organising the massive project of storing grain for the coming famine, he could not help but remember the dreams of his youth. The sheaves bowing down, the sun and moon and stars paying homage. Those dreams had seemed so impossible during the dark years of his trials. But now he was beginning to see how God had been weaving a story of redemption that was far grander than anything he could have imagined as a 17-year-old boy in his father's house. The 7 years of abundance began exactly as Joseph had predicted, and Egypt's harvests were more bountiful than anyone could remember. Under Joseph's careful supervision, vast storehouses were built in every city, and grain was collected and preserved on an unprecedented scale. The administrative system he designed was so efficient and comprehensive that it became a model for future generations. During this time, Joseph and his wife Asenath were blessed with 2 sons. He named the first Manasseh, saying, "It is because God has made me forget all my trouble and all my father's household." The second son he named Ephraim, saying, "It is because God has made me fruitful in the land of my suffering." These names revealed Joseph's heart. He was grateful for the blessing of forgetting the pain of his past, but he also recognized that God had made him fruitful precisely in the place where he had suffered most. His trials had not been meaningless. They had been the very soil in which his greatest purpose had grown. As the 7 years of abundance came to an end and the 7 years of famine began, Joseph's careful preparations proved their worth. While neighbouring countries struggled with crop failures and starvation, Egypt had grain in abundance. People came from all over the known world to buy food from Joseph, and Egypt became the lifeline for countless nations. The famine was severe throughout the world, and it reached even into the land of Canaan where Jacob lived with his family. When Jacob learned that there was grain in Egypt, he said to his sons, "Why do you just keep looking at each other? I have heard that there is grain in Egypt. Go down there and buy some for us so that we may live and not die." So 10 of Joseph's brothers went down to buy grain from Egypt. But Jacob did not send Benjamin, Joseph's younger brother, with the others because he feared that harm might come to him. Benjamin was now the only remaining son of his beloved Rachel, and Jacob could not bear the thought of losing him too. When Joseph's brothers arrived in Egypt and came before him to buy grain, they bowed down to him with their faces to the ground. Joseph recognized them immediately, but they did not recognize him. Here was the fulfillment of his boyhood dreams, his brothers bowing before him, but it came not with triumph, but with the weight of enormous responsibility. Joseph remembered his dreams about them, but he pretended to be a stranger and spoke harshly to them. "Where do you come from?" he demanded. "From the land of Canaan," they replied, "to buy food." Joseph accused them of being spies, testing them to see what kind of men they had become. Through a series of encounters, he kept Simeon as a prisoner and demanded that they bring Benjamin to prove their honesty. When they returned with Benjamin, Joseph's emotions nearly overwhelmed him, but he continued to test them. The final test came when Joseph had his silver cup planted in Benjamin's sack, then accused him of theft. When the cup was found, Joseph declared that Benjamin would become his slave. It was then that Judah, the same brother who had suggested selling Joseph years before, stepped forward and offered to take Benjamin's place as a slave, saying he could not bear to see his father's grief if Benjamin did not return. This act of selfless love broke Joseph's heart. His brothers had changed. The jealous, cruel men who had thrown him into a pit were now willing to sacrifice themselves for each other and for their father's happiness. Joseph could no longer control himself. He sent all his attendants away and revealed himself to his brothers. "I am Joseph. Is my father still living?" he said, weeping so loudly that the Egyptians heard him. His brothers were terrified, but Joseph reassured them, "Come close to me. I am your brother Joseph, the one you sold into Egypt. And now, do not be distressed and do not be angry with yourselves for selling me here, because it was to save lives that God sent me ahead of you. For 2 years now there has been famine in the land, and for the next 5 years there will be no ploughing and reaping. But God sent me ahead of you to preserve for you a remnant on earth, and to save your lives by a great deliverance. So then, it was not you who sent me here, but God." This was the heart of Joseph's story, not revenge, but redemption, not bitterness, but blessing. He had learned to see God's hand even in the betrayal and suffering he had endured. "You intended to harm me," he would later tell them, "but God intended it for good to accomplish what is now being done, the saving of many lives." Joseph brought his entire family to Egypt, where they were given the best land in Goshen. Jacob, who had mourned Joseph as dead for over 20 years, was reunited with his beloved son. The family was restored, the famine was survived, and the promises God had made to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob continued to unfold through their descendants. When Jacob died years later, Joseph's brothers feared that he might finally take revenge on them. But Joseph wept and said, "Don't be afraid. Am I in the place of God? You intended to harm me, but God intended it for good to accomplish what is now being done, the saving of many lives. So then, don't be afraid. I will provide for you and your children." Joseph lived to be 110 years old, seeing his family multiply and prosper in Egypt. Before he died, he made his brothers promise that when God eventually led them back to the Promised Land, they would carry his bones with them. Even in death, Joseph's faith looked forward to the fulfillment of God's promises. Joseph's story teaches us that God can use even the worst circumstances to accomplish his greatest purposes. The pit prepared Joseph for the palace, but more importantly, it prepared his heart for forgiveness. His sufferings were not meaningless. They were the very experiences that shaped him into a man capable of saving nations and reconciling families. In our own lives, we may face betrayal, false accusations, forgotten promises, and years of waiting that seem endless. But Joseph's story reminds us that God is always working, even when we cannot see his hand. Our calling is not to understand his timeline, but to trust his character and remain faithful in whatever circumstances we find ourselves. The dreams God gives us may take decades to fulfill, and they may come to pass in ways we never expected. But his promises are sure, his purposes are good, and his love never fails. From the pit to the palace, from slavery to salvation, from betrayal to blessing. This is the pattern of redemption that runs through Joseph's story, and through our own lives when we place our trust in the God who makes all things work together for good. Rest well tonight, dear friends of Sacred Slumber, knowing that your story too is being written by a loving God who specialises in turning mourning into dancing, ashes into beauty, and the deepest valleys into the highest mountains of purpose and joy. Sweet dreams, and may you find peace in knowing that no matter what pit you may find yourself in today, God is already preparing your palace for tomorrow.
The fire on Mount Carmel, Elijah and the prophets of Baal. Hello everyone, and welcome to Sacred Slumber. Before we dive into today's powerful message, I want to connect with each of you personally. How has your day been treating you so far? Whether you're watching this in the early morning hours as the sun rises, during your lunch break, in the middle of a busy day, or perhaps late at night when the world has quieted down, I want you to know that this moment we're sharing together is sacred. I'm curious about where you're joining us from today. Are you listening from bustling New York City, the peaceful countryside of Iowa, the sunny beaches of California, or maybe you're tuning in from across the globe in London, Sydney, or somewhere in between? Wherever you are, whatever time it is in your corner of the world, you are exactly where God wants you to be right now. If this is your first time joining us, I want to extend a warm welcome to our Sacred Rest family. We're so grateful you're here. And if you've been walking this journey with us, thank you for your continued faithfulness and support. Before we begin today's incredible story, I encourage you to subscribe to Sacred Slumber if you haven't already. Hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell so you never miss these life-changing messages that God has in store for us. Now let's prepare our hearts for what I believe will be one of the most dramatic, faith-building stories you'll hear. Today we're travelling back over 2,800 years to witness one of the most spectacular demonstrations of God's power ever recorded in human history. We're going to Mount Carmel in ancient Israel, where one man's faith stood against an entire nation's rebellion, where fire fell from heaven, and where hearts were turned back to the one true God. The fire on Mount Carmel, Elijah and the prophets of Baal. Chapter 1. A nation in spiritual freefall. Picture, if you will, the ancient kingdom of Israel during one of its darkest hours. This wasn't just a time of political upheaval or economic hardship, though both of those existed. This was a time of complete spiritual catastrophe. a moment when an entire nation had turned its back on the God who had delivered them from slavery in Egypt, who had parted the Red Sea, who had given them the Promised Land. King Ahab sat on the throne of Israel, and beside him ruled Queen Jezebel, a woman whose very name has become synonymous with wickedness and manipulation. Jezebel wasn't just content to worship false gods herself. She was determined to drag the entire nation of Israel down with her into the depths of idolatry and spiritual darkness. Under their reign, temples to Baal began sprouting up across the landscape like poisonous mushrooms after a storm. Baal was the Canaanite storm god, supposedly the controller of rain and fertility, the giver of crops and abundance. The people were drawn to him because they believed he could provide what they desperately needed: prosperity, security, and success. Sound familiar? In our modern world, we may not bow down to statues of Baal, but how many of us have made idols out of our careers, our bank accounts, our social media followers, or our pursuit of comfort and pleasure? The heart of humanity hasn't changed much in nearly 3,000 years. But Jezebel wasn't satisfied with just building temples. She launched a systematic persecution campaign against the prophets of the Lord. These faithful men and women of God were hunted down like criminals. Some were executed, others were forced to hide in caves and secret places, living in constant fear for their lives. The word of God was being silenced, and darkness was spreading across the land like a plague. Can you imagine living in such a time, when speaking the truth about God could cost you your life, when the very foundations of faith that had sustained a nation for generations were being torn down brick by brick, when it seemed like evil had won and righteousness had fled? Yet in the midst of this spiritual holocaust, God had his man. His name was Elijah, and he was about to become the most famous prophet in Israel's history. Chapter 2. The Drought of Divine Judgment. Before we meet Elijah face to face, we need to understand the backdrop against which his ministry unfolded. For 3 long years, not a single drop of rain had fallen on the land of Israel. This wasn't just an inconvenient dry spell or a minor weather pattern. This was divine judgment, God's response to a nation that had forgotten him and chased after false gods. The drought was devastating in ways that are hard for us to fully comprehend in our modern world of grocery stores and water systems. Rivers that had flowed for centuries dried up to cracked mud. Wells that had sustained families for generations ran completely dry. Crops withered in the fields, livestock died, and famine stalked the land like a relentless predator. People were desperate. Children cried from hunger. Farmers watched helplessly as their fields turned to dust. Merchants had nothing to sell, and families had nothing to eat. The very fabric of society was unravelling under the weight of this supernatural judgment. And yet, in their desperation, most of the people didn't turn back to the Lord. Instead, they cried out even more desperately to Baal, pleading with the storm god to send rain. They increased their sacrifices, intensified their rituals, and multiplied their prayers to deaf idols. They were convinced that if they just tried harder, if they just offered more, if they just believed with greater fervour, Baal would answer and the rains would come. But the skies remained as bronze hard and unyielding. Day after day, week after week, month after month, year after year, the sun blazed down mercilessly from a cloudless sky. The drought continued, and Baal remained silent. This is the world into which God sent his prophet Elijah. Not a comfortable world of revival meetings and supportive congregations, but a hostile environment where speaking God's truth could mean death, where the majority had embraced lies, and where the very elements seemed to declare that God's judgment was upon the land. Chapter 3. Enter Elijah, the man of fire. Elijah appears in the biblical narrative like a bolt of lightning splitting the darkness. We don't know much about his background or his early life. He's introduced simply as Elijah the Tishbite from Tishbe in Gilead. No impressive genealogy, no royal connections, no seminary degrees or credentials. Just a man from a small town that most people had probably never heard of. But what Elijah lacked in pedigree, he more than made up for in faith, courage, and an unshakable conviction that the Lord God of Israel was the one true God. While the nation around him bowed to Baal, Elijah stood firm. While others compromised and conformed, Elijah remained faithful. While the majority chose the easy path of popular religion, Elijah chose the narrow way of truth. God had sustained Elijah supernaturally during the 3 years of drought. First, he had sent him to the brook Cherith, where ravens brought him bread and meat every morning and evening, and he drank from the brook. When the brook dried up, God sent him to a widow in Zarephath, where a handful of flour and a little oil miraculously sustained 3 people for over a year. These experiences had built Elijah's faith to an unshakable level. He had seen God's provision in impossible circumstances. He had witnessed miracles that defied natural law. He had learned to trust completely in God's power and faithfulness, even when everything around him suggested that God had forgotten or abandoned his people. Now, as the drought entered its 3rd year, God was ready to use his seasoned servant for the greatest demonstration of divine power Israel had seen since the days of Moses. The time had come for a showdown that would echo through the ages, a confrontation that would prove once and for all who was the true God and who were merely the inventions of human imagination. Chapter 4. The Divine Commission. The word of the Lord came to Elijah with crystal clarity. Go and present yourself to Ahab, and I will send rain on the land. It was time for the drought to end, but first there would be a reckoning. God wasn't just going to quietly restore the rain and let everyone go back to their lives as if nothing had happened. He was going to make a statement that would be impossible to ignore or explain away. Elijah set out to find King Ahab, but Ahab was already looking for him. The king had been searching throughout his own kingdom and in neighbouring nations, trying to find the prophet he blamed for the drought. When Ahab finally encountered Elijah, his greeting was filled with accusation and anger. Is that you, you troubler of Israel? Can you imagine the audacity? Here was a king who had led his nation into idolatry, who had allowed his wife to murder God's prophets, who had built temples to false gods throughout the land, and he had the nerve to call God's faithful prophet a troublemaker. It's a perfect example of how sin blinds us to our own responsibility and causes us to blame others for the consequences of our own choices. But Elijah didn't back down. With the boldness that comes from knowing you're standing on the side of truth, he fired back. I have not made trouble for Israel, but you and your father's family have. You have abandoned the Lord's commands and have followed the Baals. This wasn't just a theological debate or a polite disagreement about religious preferences. This was a confrontation between the kingdom of God and the kingdom of darkness, between truth and deception, between the power of the Almighty and the impotence of human-made idols. Chapter 5. The challenge issued. Elijah then issued a challenge that would go down in history as one of the most dramatic moments in all of Scripture. Now summon the people from all over Israel to meet me on Mount Carmel, and bring the 450 prophets of Baal and the 400 prophets of Asherah who eat at Jezebel's table. Mount Carmel was the perfect location for this showdown. Rising about 1,800 feet above sea level, it offered a commanding view of the surrounding countryside and could accommodate the massive crowd that would gather. More importantly, Mount Carmel was considered sacred to Baal worship. The Canaanites believed it was one of Baal's favourite dwelling places. By choosing this location, Elijah was essentially challenging Baal on his home turf. The terms of the contest were elegantly simple. Get 2 bulls for us. Let Baal's prophets choose one for themselves, and let them cut it into pieces and put it on the wood, but not set fire to it. I will prepare the other bull and put it on the wood, but not set fire to it. Then you call on the name of your God, and I will call on the name of the Lord. The God who answers by fire, he is God. It was brilliant in its simplicity. No complicated rituals, no ambiguous signs that could be interpreted different ways, no room for trickery or deception. Fire from heaven would be the ultimate proof. The God who could send fire to consume the sacrifice would be proven to be the true God. The people's response revealed both their spiritual confusion and their deep hunger for truth. What you say is good. They were tired of the uncertainty, tired of not knowing which God to trust, tired of the drought and the suffering. They wanted a clear answer, and Elijah's challenge offered exactly that. Chapter 6. The prophets of Baal take the stage. As dawn broke over Mount Carmel, an incredible scene began to unfold. Hundreds of prophets of Baal gathered around their altar, dressed in their ceremonial robes, carrying their ritual instruments, confident in their God's ability to answer their call. After all, they outnumbered Elijah 450 to 1. They had the backing of the royal court. They had been the religious establishment for years. Surely their God would not fail them now, especially not on his sacred mountain. They began their ritual early in the morning with great enthusiasm and confidence. "Baal, answer us," they cried, their voices echoing across the mountainside. They danced around their altar with wild abandon, their movements becoming more and more frenzied as they worked themselves into a religious fervour. This wasn't a quiet, dignified ceremony. This was raw, primal religion at its most intense. They leaped and shouted, they waved their arms and beat their chests. They called upon their God with every fibre of their being. The sound of their voices, the pounding of their feet, the clashing of their instruments created a cacophony that could be heard for miles around. But as the morning wore on and became noon, something became increasingly obvious. Nobody was answering. The sky remained clear and cloudless. No fire fell from heaven. No voice spoke from the heavens. The altar remained cold and lifeless, despite all their passionate pleading. You have to understand, these weren't insincere men going through empty motions. These prophets genuinely believed in Baal. They had devoted their lives to serving him. They had staked their reputations, their careers, and their very identities on the belief that he was real and powerful. The failure of their God to respond wasn't just embarrassing, it was devastating to everything they had built their lives upon. Chapter 7. Elijah's Divine Sarcasm. As the noon sun blazed overhead and the prophets of Baal continued their increasingly desperate rituals, Elijah decided it was time for some divine commentary. With a wit that was both cutting and brilliant, he began to mock their futile efforts. "Shout louder! Surely he is a god. Perhaps he is deep in thought, or busy, or travelling. Maybe he is sleeping and must be awakened." Can you imagine the scene? Here's Elijah, one man against 450, calmly watching their frantic efforts and offering helpful suggestions for why their God might not be responding. The sarcasm was devastating because it highlighted the absurdity of their situation. If Baal was truly the almighty storm god they claimed he was, why would he need to be awakened? Why would he be too busy or distracted to answer his devoted followers in their hour of greatest need? But Elijah's mockery served a deeper purpose. than just humiliating the false prophets. He was exposing the fundamental weakness of all false gods. They are not truly there. They cannot hear because they have no ears. They cannot speak because they have no voice. They cannot act because they have no power. They are creations of human imagination, given form by human hands, but possessing no divine substance. The prophets of Baal, stung by Elijah's taunts and desperate to prove their God's reality, intensified their efforts to an almost unbelievable degree. They began to cut themselves with swords and spears, following their religious traditions until their blood flowed freely. This wasn't just symbolic, this was literal self-mutilation in the name of religious devotion. From noon until evening, they continued this horrific display, their voices growing hoarse from shouting, their bodies weakened by loss of blood, their spirits crushed by the growing realization that their God was not going to answer. The contrast couldn't have been more stark. On one side, frantic activity and desperate self-harm producing nothing. On the other side, one man waiting calmly for his turn, confident in his God's ability to act. Chapter 8. Elijah prepares his altar. As evening approached and the prophets of Baal finally exhausted themselves in defeat, Elijah stepped forward to take his turn. But before he called upon the Lord, he had some important work to do. "Come here to me," he called to all the people. This wasn't going to be a private ceremony or a mystical ritual performed in secret. Everything Elijah was about to do would be in full view of hundreds or perhaps thousands of witnesses. There would be no opportunity for trickery, no possibility of deception, no room for doubt about what actually happened. The first thing Elijah did was repair the altar of the Lord that had been torn down. This altar represented the nation's covenant relationship with God, a relationship that had been broken by years of idolatry and rebellion. By repairing it, Elijah was symbolically calling the nation back to their true identity as God's chosen people. He took 12 stones, one for each of the tribes of Israel, even though the kingdom had been divided for generations. In God's eyes, his people were still one nation, still his chosen ones, still the objects of his covenant love, despite their unfaithfulness. Each stone was a reminder of God's promises to Abraham, Isaac and Jacob, promises that remained in effect despite the people's rebellion. With these 12 stones, Elijah built an altar in the name of the Lord. Then he dug a trench around it, large enough to hold about 15 litres of water. This wasn't just for dramatic effect, it was about to serve a very important purpose in demonstrating that what was about to happen could only be attributed to divine intervention. Chapter 9. The Ultimate Act of Faith. What Elijah did next was so audacious, so seemingly foolish, that it takes your breath away. Remember, this was in the 3rd year of a devastating drought. Water was more precious than gold. People were dying of thirst. Every drop was carefully conserved and rationed. And Elijah ordered 4 large jars to be filled with water and poured over the offering and the wood. Can you imagine the gasps from the crowd? Can you picture the shock on people's faces as they watched precious, life-giving water being poured out lavishly over an altar? Some in the crowd probably thought Elijah had lost his mind. Others might have been angry at what seemed like a wasteful display. But Elijah wasn't finished. "Do it again," he said. And they did it a second time, pouring out 4 more jars of precious water over the sacrifice and the wood. "Do it a 3rd time," Elijah commanded. And a 3rd time they soaked the altar until the water ran down around it and filled the trench he had dug. 12 jars of water in total. Everything was completely saturated. The wood was soaked through. The sacrifice was drenched. The stones were wet. Even the ground around the altar was muddy with water. If anyone had been planning to suggest that Elijah had somehow hidden fire or used trickery to ignite his altar, that possibility was now completely eliminated. This act of faith was staggering. Elijah was so confident in God's power that he was willing to make the miracle as difficult as possible. He wasn't just asking God to light dry wood. He was asking him to consume a sacrifice that was literally underwater. He was putting his reputation, his ministry, and his very life on the line, betting everything on God's ability to do the impossible. Chapter 10. The Prayer That Shook Heaven and Earth. As evening approached and the time for the evening sacrifice arrived, Elijah stepped up to the altar he had prepared. The moment had come. Everything led to this point. The drought, the confrontation with Ahab, the challenge to the prophets of Baal, the repair of the altar, the soaking with water, all of it was preparation for this moment when one man would call upon the name of the Lord. But notice what Elijah didn't do. He didn't scream and shout like the prophets of Baal. He didn't dance wildly, or cut himself, or work himself into a frenzy. He didn't perform elaborate rituals, or recite complicated incantations. He simply prayed, and his prayer was a model of faith, simplicity, and complete dependence upon God. Lord, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Israel, he began, immediately identifying the God he served not as a local deity or a tribal God, but as the God of the covenant, the God who had made promises to the patriarchs and had been faithful to those promises for generations. Let it be known today that you are God in Israel, and that I am your servant, and have done all these things at your command. This wasn't about Elijah's reputation or glory. This wasn't about proving his own power or wisdom. This was about demonstrating to a watching world that the Lord alone is God, and that Elijah was merely his obedient servant. Answer me, Lord, answer me, so these people will know that you, Lord, are God, and that you are turning their hearts back again. The purpose of the miracle wasn't to show off, or to defeat enemies, but to turn hearts back to God. This was an act of divine love, a desperate attempt to rescue a nation from the spiritual destruction they had brought upon themselves. The prayer was short, simple, and powerful. No theatrical performance, no manipulation of emotions, no attempt to work up faith through human effort. Just a straightforward request from a faithful servant to his all-powerful God. Chapter 11. Fire falls from heaven. What happened next has never been equalled in human history. The response to Elijah's prayer was immediate, dramatic, and absolutely unmistakable. Fire fell from heaven. Not a small flame that gradually grew, not a spark that ignited the wood, not a natural phenomenon that could be explained by meteorology or chemistry. This was supernatural fire, divine fire, holy fire that blazed down from the throne of God himself. And this fire didn't just consume the sacrifice, it didn't just burn up the wood, it consumed everything. The offering was instantly vaporized. The wood disappeared in a flash. The 12 stones that Elijah had so carefully arranged were completely consumed. Even the soil around the altar was burned up. The water in the trench, all those precious gallons that had been poured out, was licked up by the divine flames as if it had never been there. The heat must have been incredible. The light must have been blinding. The sound must have been like thunder echoing across the mountainside. Everyone watching would have felt the power of God in a way that shook them to their very core. This wasn't just a miracle, it was a demonstration of absolute divine authority. God was making a statement that could not be ignored, denied, or explained away. He was declaring to Israel, to the prophets of Baal, to King Ahab and Queen Jezebel, and to everyone watching that he alone is God. that He alone has power over the elements, and that He alone deserves worship and obedience. Chapter 12. The people's response. When the people saw the fire fall from heaven and consume everything on the altar, their response was immediate and overwhelming. They fell prostrate on the ground, not just kneeling, but face down in the dirt, overwhelmed by the presence and power of the Almighty God. And they cried out in unison, "The Lord, He is God! The Lord, He is God!" Think about what this meant. Many of these same people had been worshipping Baal just hours before. They had been convinced that the storm god was real and powerful. They had invested their hopes, their prayers, and their sacrifices in a false deity. But now, confronted with undeniable evidence of God's power, they acknowledged the truth they had been running from for 3 years. This wasn't just an intellectual acknowledgement or a polite religious sentiment. This was a deep, heart-level recognition of divine authority. They had seen something that shattered their old beliefs and transformed their understanding of spiritual reality. The God of Israel, the God of Abraham, Isaac and Jacob, the God their fathers had worshipped. He was the true God, and all other gods were mere pretenders. The cry, "The Lord, He is God," became a declaration of faith that echoed across the mountainside and down through the centuries. It was a moment of national awakening, a turning point when an entire people group remembered who they were and whose they were. Chapter 13. Justice and Restoration. But the story didn't end with the people's declaration of faith. God's justice demanded that those who had led the nation astray face the consequences of their deception. Under Elijah's direction, the people seized the 450 prophets of Baal who had spent the day proving the powerlessness of their God. This might seem harsh to our modern sensibilities, but we need to understand the context. These men had been leading an entire nation away from the true God. They had been accomplices in the persecution and murder of God's true prophets. They had been teaching lies in the name of religion, deceiving people who were desperately seeking spiritual truth. Their deception had contributed to the spiritual darkness that had brought God's judgment upon the land. Justice was swift and final. All 450 prophets of Baal were executed, removing the source of false teaching that had poisoned the nation's spiritual life. With the false prophets dealt with and the people's hearts turned back to God, it was time for the next phase of God's plan, the restoration of His blessing upon the land. Chapter 14. The sound of abundant rain. Elijah said to Ahab, "Go, eat and drink, for there is the sound of a heavy rain." This statement is remarkable for several reasons. First, there wasn't a cloud in the sky. The weather conditions were identical to what they had been for 3 years. Hot, dry, and utterly cloudless. But Elijah had the faith to hear the sound of rain that existed only in the promise of God. This is the kind of faith that sees the invisible and hears the inaudible. Elijah wasn't looking at circumstances or relying on weather forecasts. He was trusting in the word of God, who had promised to send rain upon the land. While Ahab went to eat and drink, Elijah climbed to the top of Mount Carmel and threw himself down on the ground in prayer. This wasn't a casual request or a polite religious ritual. This was intense, fervent prayer from a man who understood that he was participating in God's plan to restore his people. 7 times Elijah sent his servant to look toward the sea for signs of rain. 6 times the servant returned with the same report. There is nothing there. But Elijah didn't give up. He didn't doubt God's promise or question his own faith. He kept praying, kept believing, kept expecting God to fulfill His word. On the 7th time, the servant returned with different news. A cloud as small as a man's hand is rising from the sea. To most people, a tiny cloud on the horizon wouldn't seem significant, especially after 3 years of drought. But to the eyes of faith, that small cloud was the beginning of God's abundant provision. Elijah immediately told his servant to run to Ahab with this message: "Hitch up your chariot and go down before the rain stops you." Chapter 15. The Storm of Restoration. What followed was one of the most dramatic weather changes in recorded history. The tiny cloud that had appeared on the horizon quickly grew and multiplied. The sky, which had been clear blue for 3 years, suddenly turned black with storm clouds. The wind began to blow with increasing intensity, and then the rain began to fall. But this wasn't a gentle shower or a light drizzle. This was a torrential downpour, a deluge that made up for 3 years of drought in a matter of hours. The rain came down in sheets so heavy that visibility was reduced to just a few feet. The ground, which had been hard as concrete from years of drought, couldn't absorb the water fast enough, and soon rivers of rainwater were flowing down every hillside and through every valley. It was as if God was saying, "You thought I had forgotten how to send rain? You believed that Baal was the god of storms? Let me show you what real divine power looks like." The storm was so intense that King Ahab, travelling in his royal chariot, had difficulty making the journey back to his palace in Jezreel. But here's one of the most amazing details of the entire story. The power of the Lord came on Elijah, and tucking his cloak into his belt, he ran ahead of Ahab's chariot all the way to Jezreel. Picture this scene. A middle-aged prophet who had just spent an entire day in intense spiritual warfare, who had just called down fire from heaven and orchestrated the execution of 450 false prophets who had just prayed intensely for rain. This same man was given supernatural strength to outrun a horse-drawn chariot for about 17 miles through a driving rainstorm. This wasn't natural human endurance. This was divine empowerment, God's way of putting an exclamation point on the entire day's events. Even in the storm, even in the exhaustion that should have followed such an intense spiritual battle, God's power was sufficient to carry his faithful servant. Chapter 16. Lessons for today. The story of Elijah on Mount Carmel is far more than just an exciting historical account. It's a template for understanding how God works in our world today and how he calls each of us to live lives of faith and courage. First, we see the power of standing alone for truth. Elijah was outnumbered 450 to 1, but he wasn't really alone because God was with him. In our culture today, it often feels like those who stand for biblical truth are vastly outnumbered by those who have embraced the false gods of our age. Materialism, relativism, hedonism, and secular humanism. But numbers don't determine truth, and God's power isn't limited by human statistics. Second, we learn that false gods will always disappoint. The prophets of Baal cried out to their God from morning until evening, but he never answered because he wasn't real. Today's false gods, money, success, pleasure, power, technology, entertainment, promise fulfillment, but can never deliver on their promises. Only the true God can satisfy the deepest longings of the human heart. Third, we see that God often chooses to work through ordinary people who have extraordinary faith. Elijah wasn't from a prominent family or an influential background. He was just a man who believed God and was willing to stake everything on that belief. God is still looking for such people today, men and women who will trust him completely and obey him fully, regardless of the circumstances or the opposition. Fourth, we learn the importance of prayer in the life of faith. Elijah's prayer was simple but powerful because it was offered in complete faith and alignment with God's will. He wasn't trying to manipulate God or impress people. He was simply communicating with his heavenly Father and trusting him to act according to his promises. Fifth, we see that God's miracles often come after periods of preparation and testing. The 3 years of drought weren't just punishment for sin, they were preparation for a miracle. God was setting the stage for a demonstration of his power that would be undeniable and unforgettable. Sometimes what looks like delay in our lives is actually divine preparation for something greater than we could imagine. Conclusion. Where is your Mount Carmel? As we conclude this incredible story, I want to ask you a personal question. Where is your Mount Carmel? What situation in your life is calling for a clear demonstration of God's power and faithfulness? What false gods have you been trusting instead of the one true God? What impossible circumstance are you facing that only divine intervention can resolve? Maybe you're facing a financial crisis that seems hopeless and you need God to provide for your needs in supernatural ways. Perhaps you're dealing with a health challenge that has left doctors puzzled, and you need the great physician to demonstrate his healing power. It could be that you're struggling with a relationship that seems beyond repair, and you need the God of restoration to work a miracle in your marriage or family. Or maybe your Mount Carmel is more internal. Maybe you've been worshipping the false gods of success, approval, comfort, or control, and you need to experience the reality of God's presence and power in a fresh way. Maybe you've been trying to live the Christian life in your own strength, and you need to discover what it means to depend completely on God's power rather than your own abilities. The same God who answered Elijah's prayer with fire from heaven is still on the throne today. He still hears the prayers of his people. He still demonstrates his power in impossible situations. He still turns hearts back to himself and brings restoration where there has been devastation. But like Elijah, we must be willing to stake everything on God's faithfulness. We must be prepared to stand alone if necessary, to trust when circumstances seem impossible, to pray with faith rather than doubt, and to give God the opportunity to show his power in ways that will leave no doubt about his reality and love. The fire that fell on Mount Carmel that day wasn't just about proving that the Lord is God, though it certainly did that. It was about a loving father reaching out to his wayward children, demonstrating his power not to destroy them but to draw them back to himself. It was about restoration, redemption, and the kind of love that will go to any lengths to rescue those who are precious to him. That same love is reaching out to you today. That same power is available to you in your situation. That same God who answered Elijah is waiting to answer your prayers and demonstrate his faithfulness in your life. The question isn't whether God is able. The question is whether you're willing to trust him completely, to step out in faith even when the odds seem impossible, and to give him the opportunity to show his power in your Mount Carmel moment. So I challenge you today, don't settle for the false gods of our culture. Don't be satisfied with a powerless religion that looks good on the surface but lacks the reality of divine presence. Cry out like the people on Mount Carmel, "The Lord, he is God. The Lord, he is God." And then watch as the fire of his presence transforms your impossible situation into a testimony of his faithfulness and power. The same God who sent fire from heaven is ready to move in your life today. Are you ready to trust him completely and see what he will do? Remember to subscribe to Sacred Rest for more life-changing messages like this one. Until next time, may you know the reality of God's presence and power in every area of your life. God bless.
Hey there, peaceful soul. Before we begin tonight's gentle journey through Scripture, I'd love to know where in the world you're listening from right now and what time it is in your corner of creation. Please leave a comment below sharing this. It's always such a blessing to see how God's Word brings rest to hearts across every time zone. And if tonight's story brings you peace, please consider subscribing to Sacred Rest for more scripture-based sleep stories delivered with calm, unhurried care. Now take a deep breath and let's rest in God's presence. The Sea of Galilee rested in quiet splendour as the day's light began its gentle retreat toward the horizon. Golden rays stretched across the water's surface, dancing and shimmering as if heaven itself had scattered coins across the deep. It had been a full day, a day when crowds pressed in from every direction, hungry for wisdom, for healing, for a glimpse of this man who spoke as no one had spoken before. Jesus had been teaching since morning, his voice carrying across the gathered multitudes. He spoke of seeds falling on different soils, of tiny mustard seeds growing into sheltering trees, of hidden treasures and precious pearls. The kingdom of heaven, he said, was like these things, sometimes hidden, always valuable, growing in ways the human eye might miss. His words were simple yet profound, accessible yet mysterious, and the crowds hung on every syllable. But even the Son of God wrapped in human flesh grew weary. As the sun began its descent, Jesus looked out at his disciples with eyes that held both exhaustion and purpose. "Let us go over to the other side," he said simply. No fanfare accompanied these words, no dramatic declaration, just a quiet invitation to cross the sea. This is where our meditation begins tonight, with this small, seemingly unremarkable statement. Let us go over to the other side. 5 ordinary words that carried extraordinary meaning. For when Jesus says, "Let us go," he already knows what lies ahead. The storm that would soon rage was not a surprise to him. The fear that would grip his disciples' hearts was already known. The peace he would speak was already prepared. The disciples, eager to follow their teacher wherever he led, began to prepare the boat. Some of them were fishermen by trade, Peter, Andrew, James, and John. Their hands calloused and strong from years of casting nets and pulling oars. They knew this sea intimately, had crossed its waters countless times. This evening crossing seemed unremarkable to them, simply another journey in their extraordinary adventure with this remarkable man. Other followers bid Jesus and the disciples farewell from the shore, perhaps still pondering the parables they had heard throughout the day. The kingdom of heaven is like. These words would linger in their hearts as they returned to their homes, planting seeds of truth that would grow in ways they couldn't yet imagine. As the boat pushed away from shore, Jesus settled into the stern. A small cushion was placed there, nothing luxurious, just a simple comfort for the teacher's rest. Several of the disciples took up the oars, their strong arms working in rhythmic unison to guide the vessel forward. Others perhaps sat quietly, watching the shoreline recede or gazing up at the vast canvas of sky that was beginning to transition from azure blue to deepening indigo. The evening air was cool against their skin, a welcome relief after the heat of the day. Birds wheeled overhead, their silhouettes dark against the warming colours of sunset. Fish occasionally broke the surface of the water, creating ripples that expanded outward in perfect circles. All seemed peaceful, all seemed well. Jesus, his body surrendering to weariness, closed his eyes. The gentle rocking of the boat, the quiet splash of water against its sides, the distant calls of birds, these formed a lullaby that invited rest. And so he slept, his head resting on the cushion, his breath falling into the deep, steady rhythm of slumber. The disciples continued their work, some rowing, others perhaps talking quietly among themselves about the day's events. What did the Master mean by this parable or that? How had he known what was in the heart of the Pharisee who had challenged him? Would they truly understand all these mysteries someday, as he had promised? As twilight deepened into dusk, stars began to appear overhead. First one, then dozens, then hundreds, until the sky above was spangled with light. On any other night, this might have been a moment of transcendent beauty, a reminder of God's promise to Abraham that his descendants would be as numerous as these very stars. But those with experience on these waters noticed something concerning. The air had changed, becoming charged with an expectancy that seasoned fishermen recognized. A slight shift in the wind's direction, a subtle change in temperature, small signs that spoke volumes to those who knew how to read them. Peter exchanged glances with Andrew, then with James. No words were needed between men who had spent their lives on these waters. Something was coming. The sea, now growing restless beneath them, had secrets to tell. Yet Jesus slept on, his face peaceful in the gathering darkness. Did the disciples consider waking him then, when the first signs appeared? Did they debate among themselves whether to alert their teacher to the changing conditions? We don't know. Perhaps they chose to let him rest, confident in their own abilities to handle whatever came. Perhaps they thought the signs would come to nothing. As the boat continued its journey across the darkening waters, the shoreline they had left grew distant, a thin line of shadow against the night sky. Ahead lay their destination, the country of the Gerasenes, but it remained out of sight, beyond the curve of the horizon. They were in the middle space now, too far from where they had been to return quickly, not yet close enough to where they were going to find shelter. It is in these middle spaces of our lives that storms often find us. Not when we're safely harboured, not when we've reached our destination, but in the vulnerable in-between, in the waiting, in the journeying, in the not yet there. The disciples could not know what lay ahead, but Jesus did. His rest was not the ignorant sleep of one caught unaware, but the peaceful repose of one who knows the end from the beginning. In this, there is profound comfort for us tonight as we rest. Whatever journey we're on, whatever middle space we find ourselves in, Jesus knows. He has already seen what we have not yet encountered. As our minds begin to slow and our bodies relax into this moment of rest, let us picture ourselves in that boat. Feel the gentle rocking beneath you. Hear the quiet splash of water against wood. See the stars appearing one by one in the vast expanse above, and know that Jesus is there with you, perfectly at peace even as the first winds of change begin to stir. It began with a whisper, a subtle change in the rhythm of the night. The stars that had shone so brightly overhead began to disappear, one by one, as clouds moved across the sky like silent spectators gathering for some celestial event. The gentle lapping of water against the sides of the boat grew more insistent, less soothing. The disciples, some of whom may have been drifting towards sleep themselves, grew more alert, their senses heightened by years of experience on these unpredictable waters. The Sea of Galilee, also known as Lake Gennesaret or the Sea of Tiberias, sits more than 600 feet below sea level, nestled in a basin surrounded by mountains. This unique geography creates a natural phenomenon well known to local fishermen. When cool air from the Mediterranean Sea, about 30 miles to the west, collides with the hot, humid air over the lake, sudden and violent storms can emerge with startling speed. This night would prove no exception to that natural law. One moment, the disciples were crossing in relative calm. The next, they found themselves battling a windstorm that seemed to descend upon them from nowhere. The Greek word used in Mark's Gospel to describe this storm is leilaps. Not a gentle rain shower or passing breeze, but a furious squall, a tempest of frightening power. The wind began to howl, no longer a whisper but a roar that filled their ears and made conversation nearly impossible. It seized the sail, straining the ropes that secured it, and threatening to tear the fabric from its moorings. Those disciples with seafaring experience would have worked quickly to secure what they could. their hands moving with practiced efficiency despite the growing chaos. Waves rose around them, no longer gentle undulations but angry mountains of water that lifted the boat high before dropping it with stomach-churning speed into the next trough. Water began to break over the sides, soaking the men to their skin and pooling at their feet. In the dim light of whatever lamps they might have had, or perhaps by now extinguished by wind and water, they could see the boat beginning to fill. For modern readers, it might be difficult to fully appreciate the terror of this moment. We who cross oceans in massive ships or fly above the clouds in airplanes may have experienced turbulence or rough seas, but few of us have truly feared for our lives while travelling. These men, however, even those who had spent their lives on the water, understood their mortality with stark clarity in this moment. The boat was filling with water faster than they could bail it out. The wind showed no signs of abating. The shore was nowhere in sight. In the ancient world where swimming was not a commonly taught skill, and where the depths of the sea represented chaos and death, their situation was dire indeed. And Jesus slept on, his head still resting on the cushion in the stern of the boat. This image of Christ sleeping peacefully while chaos rages is one of the most powerful in all of Scripture. There is something almost incongruous about it, something that both confounds and comforts. The disciples must have looked at him with bewilderment. How could anyone sleep through such a storm? Did he not feel the water soaking his garments? Did he not hear the howling wind, or feel the violent pitching of the vessel? Perhaps some of them remembered the words of Psalm 121. He who watches over you will not slumber. Indeed, he who watches over Israel will neither slumber nor sleep. Yet here was their teacher, their master, whom some had begun to believe might be the promised Messiah, deep in slumber while destruction seemed imminent. We might pause here in our meditation and consider times when God has seemed silent or sleeping in our own lives. Those dark nights when prayers appear to go unanswered. Those seasons of suffering when heaven itself seems shut tight. Those moments when we cry out, "Lord, don't you care?" For this was precisely the question that rose to the disciples' lips as fear gave way to desperation. Someone, we don't know who, moved to the stern where Jesus lay sleeping. Perhaps they shook his shoulder roughly, the protocol of respect forgotten in the face of survival's urgency. "Teacher," they cried, their voices barely audible above the storm's rage, "don't you care if we drown?" There is raw humanity in this question, the unfiltered cry of those who feel abandoned in their hour of greatest need. It's not a theologian's careful inquiry or a philosopher's pondering, but the gut-level response of frightened men who cannot understand why the one they've come to trust seems indifferent to their plight. Don't you care? How many times have these words formed in human hearts across the centuries? The parent kneeling by the bed of a suffering child, the widow standing by a fresh grave, the refugee fleeing violence with nothing but the clothes on their back, the addict fighting for sobriety and failing again. Lord, don't you care? It's worth noting that the disciples didn't question Jesus' ability to help. They questioned his concern, his heart. They believed he could do something. Why else wake him? But they wondered if he would. Did their plight move him? Did their fear matter to him? Was he as invested in their well-being as they had come to believe? In asking this question, they revealed something profound about the nature of faith. True faith isn't just believing that God can, it's trusting that God will, that his heart is good, that his love is sure, that his timing is perfect. And this is often where our faith is tested most severely, not in questioning God's power, but in questioning his character, his concern, his care. As we continue to settle into rest tonight, let's acknowledge any storms that may be raging in our own lives. Perhaps there are circumstances that have caused us to wonder if God sees, if God cares. Like the disciples, we may have experienced moments of feeling alone in the tempest, questioning whether our prayers are heard. The beauty of this story, and the comfort it offers us even now, is that Jesus' response to their cry reveals the truth about his heart. But before we explore that response, let's sit for a moment with the reality of the storm itself. Feel the wind's force, hear its howl, see the waves crashing over the sides of the boat, experience the fear, the confusion, the desperate cry for help, and know that in the midst of it all, Jesus is present, not distant, not removed, but right there in the boat with them, with us. Whatever storm we face, we do not face it alone. The Lord of all creation has chosen to journey with us, to be present with us in every turbulent moment and every threatening circumstance. As our breathing deepens and our bodies grow heavier with approaching sleep, let us find comfort in this reality. The presence of Jesus in our boat does not exempt us from storms, but it changes everything about how we experience them. He's here even when he appears to be sleeping. He hears even when he seems silent. And he will respond in his perfect time with his perfect power. Now, as we picture the disciples crowding around Jesus, as we hear their cry of "Don't you care if we drown?" let us watch and see what happens next, for the storm is about to meet its match. The chaos is about to encounter its creator. The winds and waves are about to recognize the voice of the one who called them into being. Jesus woke to the violent pitching of the boat, to the spray of water across his face, to the desperate cries of his disciples. "Teacher, don't you care if we drown?" Their question hung in the air between them, nearly lost in the howling of the wind, yet impossibly loud in its implication. Did he care? Could they truly doubt this? He who had healed the sick, restored sight to the blind, cleansed the lepers, did they think his compassion extended only to strangers and not to those closest to him? He who had called them by name, who had shared meals and long roads and countless conversations with them, did they imagine his heart was indifferent to their fear? Yet Jesus did not respond to their question directly. He did not immediately reassure them of his care or explain his apparent indifference. Instead, he rose, calm, unhurried, sovereign, and turned his attention to the storm itself. Mark's Gospel tells us that he got up, rebuked the wind, and said to the waves, "Quiet, be still." The Greek phrase used here, siopa pephimoso, carries the sense of be silent, be muzzled. It is the language one might use to quiet a disruptive animal or silence a disturbing noise. There is authority in these words, command and expectation of immediate obedience, and obey they did. The wind, which had been screaming across the water with destructive force, died away at once. The waves, which had been crashing over the sides of the boat and threatening to sink it, flattened into submission. The entire chaotic scene transformed in an instant from deadly peril to perfect calm. Imagine witnessing this moment. 1 second, you're fighting for your life against one of nature's most terrifying displays of power. The next, you're floating on a sea as smooth as glass under a clearing sky. The contrast would be disorienting, almost unbelievable. The silence following such tumult would ring in your ears. The stillness after such violent motion would leave you feeling strangely weightless. Only then, after demonstrating his authority over creation itself, did Jesus turn back to his disciples, and his words to them were not what they might have expected. No warm reassurance that yes, of course he cared, no gentle understanding of their fear. Instead, he asked them 2 pointed questions. Why are you so afraid? Do you still have no faith? These questions weren't meant to shame or condemn. Jesus was not expressing disappointment so much as issuing an invitation to examine the gap between what they professed to believe about him and how they responded when those beliefs were tested by circumstance. The first question, "Why are you so afraid?" invites examination of the source of our fears. Fear often arises from a perception of threat coupled with a sense of powerlessness to address that threat. The disciples feared drowning because they perceived the storm's power and recognized their inability to control it. But Jesus was suggesting another perspective. When he is in our boat, the equation changes. The presence of the Creator fundamentally alters the balance of power in any situation. The second question, "Do you still have no faith?" probes even deeper. These disciples had witnessed Jesus perform miracle after miracle. They had seen him heal diseases medicine couldn't touch. They had watched him cast out demons that had tormented their victims for years. They had even seen him challenge the religious authorities of their day with an authority that clearly came from above. Yet when the storm came, when their own lives were threatened, their faith faltered. They reverted to fear rather than resting in confidence that the God who had demonstrated his power in so many other circumstances remained just as powerful in their present crisis. This is a common human pattern, isn't it? We can intellectually believe in God's power and love. We can recall times when we've experienced his faithfulness. We can even testify to others about how he has worked in our lives. But when new challenges arise, particularly ones that feel overwhelming or threatening, we can forget everything we know and surrender to panic. Jesus' questions invite a different response. They challenge us to align our emotional reactions with our professed beliefs, to allow what we know about God's character to inform how we feel when facing life's storms. This is not about denying fear. Fear is a natural human emotion that even Jesus experienced in the Garden of Gethsemane. Rather, it's about preventing fear from distorting our view of God and his activity in our lives. The disciples' fear had led them to question Jesus' care for them. "Don't you care if we drown?" His questions in return invited them to question their fear instead. Was it consistent with what they knew of him? Was it justified in light of who he had revealed himself to be? As we continue our journey toward rest tonight, these questions can guide our own reflection. What fears keep us awake at night? What storms in our lives have made us wonder if God cares? And more importantly, what do we know about the character of Jesus that might speak to those fears? If Jesus is truly who Scripture reveals him to be, all-powerful yet deeply compassionate, sovereign yet intimately involved, holy yet merciful, then our fears must be evaluated in light of these truths. Not dismissed or denied, but placed within the larger context of who God is and how he works. The disciples in that boat had to reconcile their experience of the storm with their experience of Jesus' power over it. We too must reconcile our experience of life's challenges with our understanding of God's character and capabilities. This reconciliation doesn't happen once and for all. It's an ongoing process, a continued growth in trust that develops as we walk with him through both calm seas and raging tempests. Perhaps the most comforting truth in this entire account is the simple reality that Jesus was in the boat with them. He had said, "Let us go over to the other side, you will," not "let me meet you on the other side," or "to try to make it to the other side." When Jesus says, "let us go," he commits to the entire journey, not just the destination. Similarly, when Jesus calls us to follow him, he doesn't promise absence of storms. He doesn't guarantee that the path will be smooth or the journey comfortable. What he does promise is his presence with us in whatever we face. "I am with you always," he would later tell his followers, "to the very end of the age." This presence changes everything. It doesn't always change our circumstances, though sometimes, as in this story, it dramatically does. but it always changes the meaning of those circumstances and how we can respond to them. As we feel sleep drawing nearer, let us rest in this truth. Whatever storm we face, Jesus is in our boat, not as a passive passenger, but as the Lord of wind and wave, the one whose word can transform chaos into calm, the one whose presence transforms our fear into faith. The question Jesus asks, "Why are you so afraid?" isn't meant to dismiss our feelings, but to direct our focus toward the greater reality of his presence and power. The perfect love he embodies casts out fear, not by pretending the storm doesn't exist, but by reminding us that he exists within the storm with us, and that makes all the difference. In the aftermath of the storm's sudden cessation, a profound silence settled over the Sea of Galilee. The only sounds remaining might have been the gentle lapping of now calm waters against the boat's hull, the dripping of seawater from soaked clothing and hair, and perhaps the still rapid breathing of men whose hearts had not yet caught up with the dramatic change in their circumstances. The contrast could not have been more stark. Moments before, chaos had reigned, wind howling, waves crashing, men shouting in fear. Now, perfect stillness surrounded them. The sky was clearing, stars reappearing like hesitant witnesses emerging after danger has passed. The sea, which had threatened to claim their lives, now cradled their boat with gentle care. In this strange new quiet, Jesus' words hung in the air. "Why are you so afraid? Do you still have no faith?" These questions weren't harsh or condemning. They were asked by the same voice that had just commanded the elements and been instantly obeyed. They were spoken by the same lips that had taught multitudes about the kingdom of heaven, that had pronounced forgiveness to the repentant, that had offered living water to the thirsty. His tone may have been one of genuine curiosity rather than criticism, a teacher using a powerful experiential lesson to reveal what was in his students' hearts. The disciples' reaction to this moment is profoundly revealing. Mark tells us that they were terrified and asked each other, "Who is this? Even the wind and the waves obey him." This was a new kind of fear, not the desperate fear of drowning that had gripped them during the storm, but the reverent awe that comes from encountering something, someone, beyond human comprehension. Their question, "Who is this?" is perhaps the most important question any person can ask about Jesus. It's a question that has echoed through centuries across cultures within countless human hearts. Who is this man who spoke with unparalleled authority, who healed with a touch, who forgave sins as if they were his to forgive, and who, as they had just witnessed, commanded the very elements of nature with a word? The disciples had already seen Jesus perform many miracles. They had watched him heal sickness, cast out demons, even restore withered limbs. But this display of power struck them differently, perhaps because it touched so directly on their own expertise. Peter, Andrew, James, John, these were fishermen who had spent their lives on this very sea. They knew its moods and dangers. They had weathered storms before through their own skill and experience. But they had never seen anyone simply speak to a storm and have it obey. Their question reveals something profound about spiritual growth. Revelation comes in layers. We don't grasp the full reality of who Jesus is all at once. Even those who walked with him physically, who ate with him and listened to his teaching daily, came to understand his identity gradually, through accumulated experiences and progressive revelation. This moment on the sea represented a significant shift in their understanding. The Jesus they thought they knew, teacher, healer, friend, suddenly revealed himself to be Lord of creation itself. The one who had been sleeping on a cushion moments before now stood before them as the one who held authority over the very forces of nature. "Who is this?" they asked each other. They were beginning to realize that the answer was far more profound, far more cosmic, far more divine than they had previously imagined. This question invites us into our own reflection tonight. Who is Jesus to us? Is he simply a wise teacher whose moral guidance we appreciate? A historical figure who founded a religion? A comforting presence when life gets difficult? Or is he the sovereign Lord of all creation, whose authority extends over every aspect of our existence, from the largest cosmic forces to the smallest details of our daily lives? Our answer to this question shapes everything about our faith journey. If Jesus is merely a good teacher, then his words are suggestions we can take or leave. If he is simply a historical religious figure, then his relevance to our modern lives may be limited. But if he is who he claimed to be, the Son of God, one with the Father, the Word made flesh, then every word he spoke carries divine authority. Every promise he made is utterly trustworthy, and every command he gave deserves our complete obedience. The disciples in that boat were confronting this reality in a visceral, immediate way. The Jesus they thought they knew had just done something only God could do. The Psalms describe God as the One who stilled the roaring of the seas, the roaring of their waves. Psalm 65:7, and the one who stilled the storm to a whisper, the waves of the sea were hushed. Psalm 107:29. Now they had seen Jesus do exactly this, with their own eyes in their own boat, in response to their own cry for help. Their question, "Who is this?" was not merely rhetorical. It reflected genuine wrestling with an expanding understanding of Jesus' identity. And this wrestling is an essential part of authentic faith. God does not expect us to have perfect theological understanding from the beginning of our journey with him. He reveals himself to us gradually, meeting us where we are and gently expanding our capacity to know him as he truly is. For the disciples, this storm became a classroom, a place where their understanding of Jesus grew deeper and wider. Similarly, the storms of our lives often become the context in which we come to know God more truly. It's relatively easy to affirm God's goodness when life is calm and comfortable. It's when the winds howl and the waves threaten that our true understanding of his character is both revealed and refined. As we continue our journey towards sleep tonight, let's allow this holy question to linger in our minds. Who is this Jesus? Not as an abstract theological inquiry, but as a personal exploration of relationship. Who is he to me? What have I seen him do in my life? How has my understanding of him grown through seasons of both calm and storm? The beauty of this story is that it invites us to know Jesus more fully, not just as a distant miracle worker, but as the one who journeys with us through every circumstance of life. He is in our boat. He may sometimes appear to be sleeping, but he is never absent, never unaware, never unconcerned. And when he speaks, whether to rebuke a storm or to question our fear, his words carry the authority of the one who created all things and holds all things together. The wind and waves recognize his voice, because they came into being through that same voice. All things were created through him and for him, Paul would later write to the Colossians. He is before all things, and in him all things hold together. Colossians 1:16-15. This is the Jesus who accompanies us through every storm. This is the one who has promised never to leave us or forsake us. This is the Lord who may ask us, as he asked his first disciples, "Why are you so afraid?" Not to shame us for our fear, but to invite us into deeper trust based on deeper knowledge of who he truly is. As our bodies grow heavier with approaching sleep, as our thoughts begin to slow and quiet, let us rest in this profound truth. The one who commands the wind and waves is with us. And if even the storm obeys his voice, how much more can we trust him with the circumstances of our lives, with the fears that sometimes keep us awake, with the future that remains unknown to us but is fully known to him? In this trust we find not just theological truth but practical peace, the kind of peace that allows us to rest even when circumstances remain uncertain. Jesus didn't promise his disciples a storm-free journey. He promised them his presence through whatever storms might come. He offers us the same today. Who is this? The disciples asked. The answer to that question continues to unfold for all who choose to journey with him. not in abstract propositions, but in lived experience, in daily walking with the one whose authority extends over every realm and whose love reaches into every heart that opens to receive him. As the boat continued its journey across the now peaceful sea, the disciples must have fallen into a contemplative silence. The question they had asked each other, "Who is this? Even the wind and the waves obey him," would linger in their hearts and minds for days, weeks, perhaps even years to come. Each time they recalled this night, this storm, this miracle, their understanding of Jesus would deepen a little more. This is often how spiritual growth unfolds for us as well. Not primarily through intellectual study, though that has its place, but through lived experiences that reveal God's character and power in ways that transform our understanding. Head knowledge becomes heart knowledge when we see God act in response to our deepest needs and most desperate prayers. The disciples were beginning to grasp something profound. Jesus was not merely with them, he was over all things. His presence in their boat didn't just mean companionship, it meant protection, provision, and peace that transcended circumstances. Even when he appeared to be sleeping, his sovereignty remained active and absolute. As the first light of dawn began to brighten the eastern sky, they could see their destination approaching, the region of the Gerasenes on the opposite shore of the lake. Jesus had said, "Let us go over to the other side," and despite all that had transpired during the night, they were indeed arriving exactly where he had intended to take them. This small detail carries significant comfort. When Jesus sets a destination, he ensures arrival. The storm, powerful as it was, had not prevented the fulfillment of his stated purpose. It had threatened, certainly. It had frightened the disciples badly, but in the end, it had simply become another opportunity for Jesus to reveal more of himself to those who followed him. This pattern appears throughout Scripture and throughout the lives of those who walk with God. What appears to be a detour or a disaster often becomes the very context in which God manifests his glory most clearly. The storm on the sea, the fiery furnace, the lion's den, the prison cell. In Scripture, these became stages for divine revelation, not obstacles to divine purpose. As we prepare to drift into sleep tonight, there is profound rest available in this reality. Whatever storms we face, they do not take Jesus by surprise. Whatever fears arise within us, they do not diminish his power. Whatever threatens to overwhelm us, it cannot overrule his sovereign declaration over our lives. If Jesus has said to us, in any area of our lives, "Let us go to the other side," then we can rest assured that no storm, internal or external, can prevent us from reaching the destination he has established. The journey may include unexpected turbulence. We may experience moments of genuine fear, but the presence of Jesus in our boat, in our lives, our circumstances, our hearts, guarantees safe passage. This doesn't mean we won't get wet, doesn't mean the journey will always feel comfortable or proceed according to our preferred timeline. The disciples in that boat experienced genuine terror before they witnessed miraculous calm. They got soaked to the skin. They may have lost cargo overboard. The boat likely required bailing out and repairs afterward, but they made it to the other side because Jesus had declared that this would be so, and in the process, they came to know him more deeply than they had before. The storm became not an obstacle to their progress, but a vehicle for their spiritual growth. As we reflect on this story one final time tonight, let's consider 3 enduring comforts it offers to all who journey with Jesus. First, Jesus is present in every storm. He may not manifest his power immediately or in the ways we expect, but he's never absent from our struggles. The psalmist wrote, "God is our refuge and strength, an ever-present help in trouble. Therefore we will not fear, though the earth give way and the mountains fall into the heart of the sea, though its waters roar and foam, and the mountains quake with their surging. Psalm 46:1-3. This presence is not just comforting, it is transformative. It changes how we experience our circumstances, even when it doesn't immediately change the circumstances themselves. Second, Jesus' timing is perfect. He allowed the storm to rage for a time before calming it, not because he was indifferent to the disciples' fear, but because the experience would deepen their understanding and strengthen their faith. Similarly, when he seems silent or inactive in our lives, it is never due to indifference. His timing takes into account purposes and perspectives that extend and far beyond our immediate comfort, encompassing our long-term growth and God's eternal glory. Third, Jesus' authority is absolute. When he spoke to the wind and waves, they had no choice but to obey. The same voice that said, "Let there be light" at creation, now said, "Be still" to the storm, with the same creative authority and the same immediate result. This ultimate authority means that nothing we face, no circumstance, no enemy, no fear, no failure, is beyond his power to redeem, restore, or transform according to his perfect will. These truths don't eliminate life's storms, but they fundamentally change how we experience them. They allow us to sleep, literally and figuratively, in the sovereignty of the one who has promised to bring us safely to the other side. As your body relaxes more deeply now, as your breathing slows and your thoughts begin to drift, imagine yourself in that boat after the storm has ceased. Feel the gentle rocking of the vessel on calm waters. See the stars reflected on the surface like scattered diamonds. Hear the quiet lapping of small waves against the wooden hull. And most importantly, know that Jesus is there with you, awake, aware, almighty. The night is passing. Dawn approaches. The shore draws nearer with each moment. And the one who commanded the storm with a word continues to hold you in the palm of his hand, guiding your vessel to exactly where he intends it to go. In this assurance there is deep peace. In this knowledge there is perfect rest. In this presence there is complete safety. Whether we find ourselves currently in the midst of a raging storm, in the calm that follows, or in the ordinary moments between dramatic events, the truth remains. Jesus is with us. Jesus is for us, and Jesus will bring us safely to the other side. So breathe deeply now. Release the tension you may be holding in your shoulders, your jaw, your hands, your mind. Allow your body to grow heavy with approaching sleep. Hello, dear soul, and welcome to tonight's sacred story. Before we begin, I'd love to gently invite you to share. Where in the world are you listening from tonight? And what time is it as you begin to rest? It's always beautiful to see how far this quiet circle of peace and God's word stretches around the world. And if you find peace and comfort tonight in this gentle story, please consider subscribing to Sacred Rest, where you can drift into sleep surrounded by scripture, stillness, and the tender presence of God. Now, take a slow, calming breath and settle in. Tonight, we walk through golden fields of faith as we enter the book of Ruth. In the gentle hills of Judah, beneath a sky that once poured abundance upon the land, the town of Bethlehem, whose name itself means house of bread, had become a place of emptiness. The fields lay parched, the grain stores depleted, and hunger walked freely through the streets that once overflowed with harvest songs. In one small home, a woman named Naomi whispered prayers as she packed what little remained of her family's possessions. Her husband Elimelech stood at the threshold, his eyes fixed on the horizon, toward the land of Moab where rumours of plenty had reached their desperate ears. Their 2 sons, Mahlon and Chilion, young men with dreams still unformed, helped secure their meagre belongings for the journey ahead. "Is this truly what Yahweh wishes for us?" Naomi asked softly, her hands trembling slightly as she folded a well-worn shawl. "To leave the land of our fathers?" Elimelech's voice was gentle but firm. "Sometimes faith means following the path of provision, wherever it leads. We go to survive, beloved. We go to live." And so they set out, a small family among many who sought survival beyond their homeland's borders. The road stretched long before them, a winding path into uncertainty. With each step away from Bethlehem, Naomi felt the weight of leaving grow heavier, like gathering storm clouds behind them. Moab received them with fields less barren than those they had left. They built a simple life there, foreigners in a strange land that worshipped strange gods. They kept to themselves, honouring the Sabbath in quiet ways, speaking of Yahweh in evening whispers when the day's work was done. But sorrow knows no boundaries, respects no borders. It found them even there, across the Dead Sea from their homeland. First came the quiet, unexpected night when Elimelech did not wake with the dawn. Naomi wept as they buried him according to their customs, as best they could in foreign soil. Her sons stood like slender reeds on either side of her, bending in the wind of grief but not breaking. Time continued its patient march. The sons found wives among the Moabite women. Mahlon married Ruth, a woman with gentle eyes and a voice like summer rain. Chilion took Orpah, whose laughter could brighten even their darkest days of longing for home. For 10 years they lived thus, not in abundance, but in enough, until enough became too little and the shadows returned. First Mahlon grew ill, his strength fading like evening light. Then Chilion, as if unable to walk this world without his brother, followed him into that quiet night from which no traveller returns. 3 widows remained, their grief a shared language that needed no translation. When news reached them that the famine had lifted in Judah, Naomi's heart turned homeward. What remained for her in this land of sorrows? Better to die in the place of her birth, among her own people, than to continue as a stranger in a land that had taken everything she loved. "Go back," she told her daughters-in-law, her voice thick with both love and sorrow. "Return to your mothers' homes. May Yahweh deal kindly with you, as you have dealt with the dead and with me." She kissed them farewell, and the 3 women wept together, their tears mingling like rivers converging. Orpah's departure was a slow, reluctant walking away, her form growing smaller on the horizon, turning back once, twice, before finally disappearing around a bend in the road. But Ruth stayed. When Naomi urged her again to follow Orpah's path, Ruth's embrace tightened, her voice steady despite her tears. "Do not urge me to leave you," she whispered, the words flowing from somewhere deeper than thought. "Where you go, I will go. Where you stay, I will stay. Your people will be my people, and your God, my God. Where you die, I will die, and there I will be buried. May Yahweh deal with me, be it ever so severely, if even death separates you and me." Naomi, who had thought herself empty of all feeling save grief, felt something stir within her breast, small as a mustard seed, fragile as a sparrow's first flight. Not quite hope, but perhaps its distant cousin. And so they walked together, 2 widows on the road to Bethlehem, Naomi returning, Ruth arriving. The older woman's steps were heavy with memories, the younger's light with the strange freedom that comes from choosing one's path with complete clarity. They arrived as the barley harvest was beginning, the fields around Bethlehem rippling like a green sea in the gentle breeze. Women drawing water recognized Naomi despite the years and sorrows that had reshaped her face. "Can this be Naomi?" they asked, voices bright with surprise. "Do not call me Naomi," she replied, the name that meant pleasant now a bitter irony on her tongue. "Call me Mara, for the Almighty has made my life very bitter. I went away full, but Yahweh has brought me back empty." As the women of Bethlehem welcomed them with curious eyes and hesitant embraces, Ruth stood quietly by Naomi's side, her hand a steady presence on the older woman's arm. In this moment, on this threshold between past and future, neither could know what fields of possibility lay before them, what harvest Yahweh was already preparing, or how their names would one day be spoken with reverence across centuries yet unborn. They knew only this: the road behind them was empty, and the road ahead unknown, but they would walk it together, step by faithful step, beneath the watchful eyes of a God who sees even sparrows when they fall. The sun had barely lifted itself above the eastern hills when Ruth rose from her mat, careful not to disturb Naomi's rare peaceful sleep. The small house they had secured, more a room than a home, was cool in the early morning light, shadows still clinging to the corners like reluctant dreams. Ruth wrapped herself in a shawl, the fabric thin but serviceable, and tied back her hair with practiced movements. She had been a daughter of comfort in Moab. Now she was a gleaner in a foreign land. The transition might have broken someone with less resilience, but Ruth had discovered a quiet strength within herself, not the kind that roars or demands attention, but the kind that simply continues, putting one foot before the other when all other options have vanished. "I will go to the fields today," she had told Naomi the night before. "Perhaps someone will allow me to glean behind their harvesters." Naomi had nodded, gratitude and sorrow mingling in her tired eyes. "Go, my daughter," she'd whispered. "May Yahweh guide your steps." Now, as Ruth stepped into the awakening streets of Bethlehem, she carried those words like a small flame against the uncertainty of the day ahead. The law of Moses provided for the poor, the widow, the foreigner. They were permitted to gather what the harvesters missed or deliberately left behind. It was not charity but dignity, a way of working for one's bread even when one owned no land. But Ruth was doubly vulnerable, both widow and foreigner. Which field would welcome her? Would the law's protection extend to a Moabite woman? These questions followed her like shadows as she made her way to the edges of town where the barley fields began their gentle roll toward the horizon. She paused at the boundary of the first field she encountered, watching as workers began to form lines, their sickles catching the morning light with brief flashes of brilliance. The field's owner was not present, but the foreman eyed her with suspicion. "Move along," he called, not unkindly but firmly. "We have enough local gleaners already." Ruth nodded and continued, her heart sinking slightly but her resolve undiminished. The second field brought similar results. By the time she reached the third, the sun had climbed higher, and her throat was dry with thirst and unspoken prayers. This field seemed different somehow. The workers moved with a relaxed efficiency, and there was conversation, even occasional laughter among them. Ruth hesitated, then approached the foreman, her eyes modestly lowered but her voice clear. "Please, sir," she said, "might I glean among the sheaves behind your harvesters? I will be careful not to disturb their work." The foreman studied her for a long moment, noting her foreign accent, the quality of her garments that spoke of better days now past. Something in her demeanour, a dignity that hardship had failed to diminish, made him nod slowly. "You may," he said. "Stay close to my servant girls, drink from our water jars when you thirst, and rest in the shade when the sun grows too fierce." Ruth's gratitude was a physical sensation, warm in her chest. "Thank you," she whispered. "You're most kind to a stranger." The work was harder than anything she'd done before, bending, searching, gathering the scattered stalks left behind. The sun climbed higher, its heat a heavy blanket across the fields. The other gleaners, mostly local widows and their children, kept their distance, though their curious glances sometimes found her. But Ruth worked steadily. Her determination measured in each stalk added to her growing bundle. By midday she'd gathered enough to make the effort worthwhile, though her back ached and her hands were rough with new blisters. She was resting briefly in the shadow of a large sycamore at the field's edge when a commotion among the workers drew her attention. A man had arrived, tall, broad-shouldered, with the bearing of someone accustomed to respect. The foreman hurried to greet him, and the workers called out blessings. "The Lord be with you," the man responded, his voice carrying across the field. "The Lord bless you," they answered in unison. This, then, was the owner of the field where Ruth had found favour. She watched as he moved among his people, speaking to each, asking after families, offering words that brought smiles to weary faces. There was something different about him, a kindness that seemed as natural as breathing. When his circuit of the field brought him near where Ruth rested, he paused, his gaze falling on her with quiet curiosity. "Who is this young woman?" he asked his foreman. "She is the Moabite who came back with Naomi," the man replied. "She asked permission to glean behind the harvesters. She has worked steadily since morning, with only this brief rest." The owner, Boaz was his name, Ruth heard someone nearby whisper, approached her then. Instinctively she rose and bowed slightly, uncertain of the proper protocol but determined to show respect. "Listen, my daughter," he said, his voice gentle but firm. "Do not go to glean in another field. Stay here with my servant girls. Watch where they harvest and follow them. I have told the men not to touch you, and when you are thirsty, drink from the jars the men have filled." Ruth's surprise made her bold. She bowed lower, her voice barely audible even to herself. "Why have I found such favour in your eyes that you notice me, a foreigner?" Boaz's answer was unexpected in its thoughtfulness. "I have been told all that you have done for your mother-in-law since your husband's death, how you left your father and mother and your homeland to come to a people you did not know before. May Yahweh repay you for what you have done. May you be richly rewarded by the God of Israel, under whose wings you have come to take refuge." His words washed over Ruth like cool water on a parched day. For so long she'd been defined by what she had lost: husband, homeland, security. Now, for the first time, someone saw what she'd chosen, what she had given, what she had become. "You have put me at ease, my lord," she said, her voice steadier now. "You have spoken kindly to your servant, though I do not have the standing of one of your servant girls." When the meal break came, Boaz himself invited her to share bread with the harvesters. He handed her roasted grain, more than she could eat, and she saved some for Naomi. Throughout the afternoon, Ruth noticed that the harvesters seemed to be dropping more grain than seemed accidental. Once she caught the foreman's eye as he instructed a worker to deliberately leave a small bundle behind. He looked away quickly, but not before she glimpsed something like approval in his gaze. When evening came and Ruth gathered her gleaning, an effort of barley, far more than she had dared hope for, she felt something she had not expected to feel again: the quiet satisfaction of provision, of having enough for tomorrow. As she walked back toward Bethlehem, the setting sun painting the limestone buildings in shades of amber and rose, Ruth carried not just barley, but something weightier: the knowledge that in this strange new land, under the wings of a God she was still coming to know, she had been seen. Not as Naomi's burden, not as an unwelcome foreigner, but as someone worthy of kindness, and in the shadow of that kindness, small seeds of possibility had begun to stir in the soil of her heart. The soft glow of oil lamps pushed back the evening darkness as Ruth entered the small dwelling she shared with Naomi. Her mother-in-law sat in the dimness, her hands, once strong and capable, now resting idle in her lap, testament to a weariness that went beyond physical exhaustion. "Is that you, my daughter?" Naomi called, her voice brightening slightly. "It is," Ruth answered, setting down her bundle with a soft thud. The sound seemed to fill the small space with promise. Naomi leaned forward, her eyes widening as Ruth opened the cloth to reveal the day's gleaning, golden barley catching the lamplight like treasure. "Where did you glean today?" she asked, running her fingers through the grain with wonder. "Blessed be the one who took notice of you." Ruth began to prepare a portion of the grain for their evening meal as she recounted the day's events, the field, the unexpected kindness, the owner who had spoken to her with respect rather than suspicion. "The man's name was Boaz," she finished, watching as something flickered across Naomi's face. Recognition, then a sudden animation that had been absent for so long. "Boaz!" Naomi exclaimed, her voice stronger than Ruth had heard it in months. "That man is a relative of ours, one of our guardian redeemers." "Guardian redeemer?" Ruth echoed, unfamiliar with the term. Naomi's eyes held a spark now, like embers rekindling. "In our laws, in our customs, a guardian redeemer is a relative who has the responsibility to protect the interests of the needy members of the extended family, to redeem property that has been sold in times of hardship, to continue the family line." Her voice trailed off, her thoughts clearly racing ahead of her words. "The Lord has not stopped showing his kindness," Naomi whispered, almost to herself. "That man is one of our closest relatives." As they ate their simple meal of roasted grain and water, Ruth noticed that Naomi ate with more appetite than she had shown since their return to Bethlehem. Occasionally, the older woman would pause, her head tilted slightly as if listening to distant music only she could hear. The barley harvest continued, and Ruth returned to Boaz's fields each day. True to his word, she was protected, provided for, included in the shared meals. Some of the local women began to speak to her, their initial wariness giving way to cautious friendship. Ruth learned their names, heard stories of their children, shared in the communal rhythm of the harvest. When the barley harvest gave way to wheat, she remained in Boaz's fields, her presence now familiar, her diligence respected. Each evening she returned to Naomi with her gleanings. Each morning she rose before dawn to begin again. As the wheat harvest neared its end, Naomi called Ruth to sit beside her one evening. The older woman's face was thoughtful, her voice quiet but determined. "My daughter," she began, "should I not seek rest for you, that it may be well with you? Is not Boaz our relative, with whose young women you have been working? See, he's winnowing barley tonight at the threshing floor." Ruth listened carefully as Naomi outlined a plan, bold, unconventional, but rooted in custom and law. She was to bathe, anoint herself with fragrant oil, put on her best garment, and go to the threshing floor where Boaz would be sleeping to guard the harvest. After he had eaten and drunk and lain down, she was to uncover his feet and lie down there, a symbolic gesture, a quiet request for protection. "All that you say I will do," Ruth promised, though her heart fluttered with uncertainty. She trusted Naomi's wisdom, trusted that this was not a plan born of desperation but of genuine care and cultural understanding. That night, the stars seemed to hang lower in the sky as Ruth made her way to the threshing floor. The celebration of harvest's end was winding down. Men who had worked hard now rested deeply, their forms dark shapes against the pale circle of the threshing floor. She moved quietly, carefully, finding Boaz where he slept at the edge of a heap of grain. With trembling hands she uncovered his feet and lay down, her heart pounding so loudly she feared it might wake him before the right moment. The night air was cool, the ground hard beneath her, but Ruth remained still, waiting. Near midnight, Boaz stirred, startled to find someone at his feet. "Who are you?" he asked, his voice thick with sleep but not angry. "I am Ruth, your servant," she answered, her voice barely above a whisper. "Spread the corner of your garment over me, for you are a guardian redeemer." There was a long silence during which Ruth could hear only her own heartbeat and the distant call of a night bird. Then Boaz spoke, his voice warm with emotion she hadn't expected. "The Lord bless you, my daughter," he said gently. "This kindness is greater than what you showed earlier. You have not run after younger men, whether rich or poor, and now don't be afraid. I will do for you all you ask. All the people of my town know that you are a woman of noble character." His words washed over her like a blessing, affirming not just her request but her person, her character, her choices, her worth. "It is true that I am a guardian redeemer," he continued, his voice thoughtful, "but there is a guardian redeemer more closely related than I. Stay here for the night, and in the morning, if he wants to redeem you, good, let him redeem you. But if he is not willing, as surely as the Lord lives, I will redeem you. Now, lie here until morning." Ruth lay at his feet until dawn began to paint the eastern sky with the first pale colours of day. Before it was light enough for people to recognize each other, Boaz gently woke her. "Let it not be known that a woman came to the threshing floor," he said, practical and protective. Then he measured out 6 measures of barley, a generous gift, a promise of more to come, and placed it in her shawl. "Don't go back to your mother-in-law empty-handed," he explained. When Ruth returned and recounted the night's events, Naomi's eyes shone with a mixture of tenderness and satisfaction. "Wait, my daughter," she counselled, "until you find out what happens, for the man will not rest until the matter is settled today." And as the morning light filled their small home, Ruth felt a strange peace settle over her. Not the peace of certainty, for much remained unresolved, but the peace that comes from having taken a step in faith, from having placed one's future in hands both human and divine. Outside, the streets of Bethlehem were coming to life. Somewhere in the town, Boaz was already moving toward the city gate, where matters of law and redemption were settled. Whatever the day would bring, Ruth knew that she had been seen, heard and valued, not despite her foreignness, her widowhood, her poverty, but somehow mysteriously, because of the person these circumstances had revealed her to be. And in that knowledge, she found a quiet strength to wait, to hope, to trust in the unfolding of a story that suddenly seemed larger than her own life. A story written in fields of barley and wheat, in promises spoken in the darkness, in the steadfast love of a God who sees the sparrow fall and counts the hairs on every head. The morning light spilled across Bethlehem like honey warm and golden. Boaz had risen early, his mind filled with purpose, his heart with a mixture of hope and determination. He made his way to the town gate, the place where elders gathered, where business was conducted, where justice was administered in full view of the community. He had barely settled himself when the guardian redeemer he had mentioned to Ruth approached. "Come over here, my friend," Boaz called, motioning to a seat beside him. "Sit down here." The man complied, curious about this formal invitation. Boaz then gathered 10 elders of the town, asking them to sit as witnesses. What was about to transpire was no small matter. It concerned inheritance, redemption, the continuation of a family line that had nearly been extinguished. "Naomi, who has returned from Moab," Boaz began carefully, "is selling the piece of land that belonged to our relative Elimelech. I thought I should bring the matter to your attention and suggest that you buy it in the presence of these seated here and in the presence of the elders of my people." The relative's eyes brightened with interest. Land was wealth, security, legacy. "I will redeem it," he said promptly. But Boaz was not finished. His next words were measured, precise, laying out the full implications of redemption. "On the day you buy the land from Naomi, you also acquire Ruth the Moabite, the dead man's widow, in order to maintain the name of the dead with his property." The relative's expression shifted. To redeem the land was one thing, a sound investment, but to marry Ruth meant dividing his own inheritance, complicating his family line. His enthusiasm visibly cooled. "Then I cannot redeem it," he said, "because I might endanger my own estate. You redeem it yourself. I cannot do it." To formalise the transaction, the man removed his sandal, an ancient custom signifying the transfer of redemption rights. "Buy it yourself," he said, handing the sandal to Boaz. Boaz turned to the elders and all the people gathered at the gate. "Today you are witnesses," he declared, his voice carrying across the morning stillness, "that I have bought from Naomi all the property of Elimelech, Kilion, and Mahlon. I have also acquired Ruth the Moabite, Mahlon's widow, as my wife, in order to maintain the name of the dead with his property, so that his name will not disappear from among his family or from his hometown." The elders and all at the gate responded with one voice, "We are witnesses. May the Lord make the woman who is coming into your home like Rachel and Leah, who together built up the family of Israel. May you have standing in Ephrathah and be famous in Bethlehem. Through the offspring the Lord gives you by this young woman, may your family be like that of Perez, whom Tamar bore to Dia." Their blessing echoed against the stone walls of Bethlehem, a public proclamation of hope and expectation. In that moment, among witnesses and with proper legal procedure, Ruth's journey from widow to wife, from foreigner to family, from gleaner to landowner was complete. When Boaz returned to tell Ruth what had transpired, he found her helping Naomi prepare the midday meal, her movements graceful despite the humble task. At the sight of him in the doorway, both women paused, their eyes questioning. "It is done," he said simply. "All that I promised has been accomplished." Ruth's marriage to Boaz was celebrated with the quiet joy of those who have known sorrow and found unexpected sweetness on the other side. Naomi, who had returned to Bethlehem empty, now found herself part of a home filled with new beginnings. The seasons turned, bringing change to the land and to the small family. When Ruth's time came to deliver her first child, the women of Bethlehem gathered around her, the same women who had once whispered about the foreign daughter-in-law, now offering support and wisdom as she laboured. The child was a son, strong and healthy. They placed him in Naomi's arms, this woman who had lost both husband and sons, who had called herself bitter and empty. Now, as she cradled her grandson, the women of Bethlehem blessed her. "Praise be to the Lord, who this day has not left you without a guardian redeemer. May he become famous throughout Israel. He will renew your life and sustain you in your old age. For your daughter-in-law, who loves you, and who is better to you than 7 sons, has given him birth." They named the child Obed, which means serving or worshipping, a name that spoke of gratitude, of recognition that this child was not just the continuation of a family line, but a gift from a God who sees the end from the beginning. What none of them could know, as they celebrated the birth with bread and wine and laughter, was that this child, Obed, would one day be the grandfather of David, the shepherd boy who would become Israel's greatest king. And from David's line, centuries later, would come the Messiah, the ultimate Redeemer, whose story of love and sacrifice would echo Ruth's loyalty and Boaz's redemption on a cosmic scale. As Boaz watched Ruth with their son, he marvelled at the intricate weaving of their lives, how sorrow had led to joy, how loss had opened the door to finding, how endings had become beginnings. He thought of the day he had first noticed Ruth in his fields, her quiet dignity as she gleaned among the sheaves. How could he have known then what this foreign woman would come to mean not only to him, but to the future of his people? In the soft twilight of their home, with Naomi singing gentle lullabies to Obed and Ruth's hand warm in his own, Boaz understood that some harvests are gathered not in fields of grain, but in the human heart, in acts of kindness, in choices of loyalty, in the courage to begin again when all seems lost. Outside their window, the hills of Bethlehem were turning purple with evening shadows. Somewhere in those hills, shepherds watched their flocks, stars began their nightly vigil, and the world continued its ancient rhythms of planting and harvest, of birth and death, of loss and redemption. But within this one small home, within these few beating hearts, a miracle had occurred. The quiet, everyday miracle of restoration, of empty hands being filled again, of bitter lives turning sweet, of a future reclaimed from the ashes of the past. And as night fell over Bethlehem, as oil lamps were lit and evening prayers whispered, as the infant Obed drifted into sleep secure in the knowledge of being utterly loved, the story of Ruth and Boaz, of faithful love and kindness reciprocated, became another golden thread in the tapestry of faith that would one day welcome the world's Redeemer. The stars appeared one by one in the deepening blue of the evening sky, like silver seeds scattered across a celestial field. In homes throughout Bethlehem, oil lamps cast their gentle glow against limestone walls, and families gathered for evening meals, for prayers, for the sharing of the day's small victories and concerns. In one such home, the home of Boaz, Ruth, and Naomi, the day was drawing to its peaceful close. Little Obed, now a toddler with his father's strong build and his mother's gentle eyes, had been tucked into bed after a story from his grandmother Naomi. His breathing had deepened into the steady rhythm of childhood sleep, innocent and complete. Ruth sat in the courtyard, her fingers working methodically at a loom, creating fabric for their household. The rhythmic movement of the shuttle was soothing, meditative, a dance between yarn and skill that produced something both beautiful and necessary. Boaz watched her from the doorway, struck again by the quiet grace that had first drawn him to her in the fields. "Your hands create such beauty," he said softly, joining her in the cool evening air. Ruth smiled, her eyes never leaving her work. "My mother taught me to weave when I was a child," she replied. "She said that the making of cloth is like the making of a life, thread by thread, day by day, until a pattern emerges that was invisible at the beginning." Naomi appeared in the doorway, carrying a small cup of wine. "The child sleeps," she announced, her voice warm with contentment. "He asked again for the story of how his mother came from a distant land." "And did you tell him?" Boaz asked, making room for Naomi on the bench beside him. "I did," Naomi nodded, taking a small sip of wine. "I told him how Ruth chose love over safety, how she gleaned in the fields, how you noticed her and showed kindness." "He likes that part," Ruth added with a smile, "the part where his father was the hero." Boaz shook his head gently. "If there is a hero in our story, beloved, it is not I. It is you who left everything familiar to follow Naomi. It is Naomi who endured loss upon loss, yet found the strength to return home. It is the Lord who guided each step, though we could not see the path ahead." The three sat in comfortable silence for a moment, each lost in their own thoughts. The night air was cool but not cold, fragrant with the scent of ripened fruit from the small orchard that bordered their property. In the distance, a shepherd's flute played a melancholy tune, its notes drifting over the sleeping town like a blessing. "Do you ever think," Naomi said eventually, her voice thoughtful, "of how differently things might have unfolded if the famine had never come, if my sons had lived, if Ruth had returned to her mother's house as Orpah did?" Boaz reached for Ruth's hand, his calloused palm enveloping her smaller one. "I think of it often," he admitted, "how 1,000 different choices, 1,000 different circumstances might have led us all elsewhere. Yet here we are, brought together by both sorrow and joy." Ruth set aside her weaving, her eyes reflecting the first bright stars. "In Moab," she said softly, "we had a saying, The path to the garden often leads through the desert. I did not understand it fully until I lived it. And now, Naomi asked. Now I understand that sometimes the desert is necessary, Ruth answered. Sometimes the empty road, the lonely field, the long night of waiting, these are not detours from God's plan, but the very path itself. Boaz nodded, his face solemn in the gathering darkness. When I was a younger man, he said, I often questioned why the Lord had not blessed me with a wife, with children. I watched my friends build families while I built barns and storehouses. I wondered if I had somehow missed the fullness of life. He looked at Ruth, his eyes soft with wonder even after these years together. Now I see that I was waiting for you, though I did not know it. That each harvest I oversaw, each field I planted, was preparation for the day when a Moabite widow would come to glean among my sheaves. Naomi's laugh was gentle, without bitterness. And I, who accused the Lord of emptying my hands, look what he has filled them with. She gestured toward the house where Obed slept, toward the small but thriving household that had grown around her. Sometimes emptiness is just the space God is creating for something new. As they sat together in the deepening twilight, a sense of reverent gratitude settled over them. Not the loud exuberance of those who have never known loss, but the deeper, quieter joy of those who have walked through shadows and found light waiting on the other side. The tale of their lives, this unexpected family, formed from fragments of broken dreams, would be told and retold through generations. Not because it was extraordinary in its outward circumstances, but because it revealed an extraordinary truth, that in the hands of a loving God nothing is wasted. Not grief, not loyalty, not kindness, not love freely given with no expectation of return. In the quiet darkness of Bethlehem, as the household of Boaz and Ruth prepared for sleep, they could not know how their story would echo through time, how the great-grandson of their son would be anointed king of Israel, how from their lineage would come the promised Messiah. They knew only this, that the God who had led them through famine and loss, through foreign fields and threshing floors, through legal proceedings and new beginnings,